I am Sienna Carmichael, 33 years old and sitting in a probate courtroom while my father tried to legally steal my inheritance was not how I planned to spend my Tuesday. Your Honor, she can barely pay rent, my father, Richard sneered, adjusting his expensive tailored suit. A high school dropout is completely unfit to manage a 25% share of a $50 million trust. The judge smirked, holding his wooden gavel ready to strike my name from my grandfather's will. I simply smoothed out my blazer and smiled. What they did not know was that I did not need to pay rent because my private equity firm bought the very buildings they lived in. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in a wealthy suburb of New York meant projecting a life of absolute privilege to outsiders. But inside the walls of the Carmichael estate, emotional cruelty and manipulation were the daily reality. My father Richard was the CEO of a prominent real estate empire, a man who believed that women existed solely to look beautiful and secure strategic marriages for his business. When I was 18, I refused to follow his strict, suffocating rules. I refused to major in a subject he chose, and I refused to date the sons of his wealthy investors. The retaliation was swift and brutal. My father cut off my college fund entirely, and my stepmother Diane gleefully packed my bags and left them on the front porch. I walked away from that house with nothing but a single duffel bag and a determination to never rely on them again. For 15 years, I built my life in complete secrecy. I started at the bottom, working grueling hours in finance, saving every penny, and eventually founding my own private equity firm on Wall Street. I kept a deliberately low profile, ensuring my family never knew about my rapid ascent in the financial world. To them, I was just the rebellious failure who had disappeared into the city. The only person in my family who kept in touch with me was my grandfather. He saw my drive and my potential. When he passed away, he deliberately structured his $50 million trust to bypass my father's complete control, leaving 25% directly to me. He knew my father was mismanaging the family business and wanted to ensure I received my rightful share. But my father was not going to let a quarter of that fortune slip through his fingers without a fight. He dragged me to probate court, determined to prove I was incompetent so he could seize total control of the assets. The heavy mahogany doors of the courtroom felt suffocating as my father stood before Judge Warren. Richard projected the image of a deeply concerned patriarch sighing heavily as he delivered his performance. Your Honor, my father continued, his voice echoing in the quiet room. Sienna left our home as a teenager. She abandoned her education and chose a life of reckless rebellion. To hand her a portion of a $50 million trust would be a catastrophic mistake. She has no financial literacy, no business acumen, and frankly, no respect for the legacy my father built. I sat alone at the respondent table, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. Behind me in the gallery sat my stepmother Diane and my younger half-sister Felicity. I could hear their quiet snickering bouncing off the wooden pews. Diane whispered loudly enough for me to hear about my simple dark suit, comparing it unfavorably to their flashy designer outfits paid for by my grandfather's money. Felicity, the undeniable golden child of the family, rolled her eyes and loudly snapped her chewing gum, completely unbothered by the formal setting. They were treating this legal proceeding like a spectator sport, entirely confident that they had already won. Then my brother-in-law, Andre Washington, stepped forward. Andre was Felicity's husband and the chief financial officer of the Carmichael family empire. He was a sharply dressed African-American man with a silver tongue and an ego that rivaled my father's. He moved with the smooth arrogance of a man who believed he was always the smartest person in the room. He approached the judge's bench carrying a thick leather binder. Your Honor, Andre said smoothly, his voice dripping with professional concern. As the CFO of the family enterprise, I felt it was my fiduciary duty to run a standard background check on Sienna before entrusting her with liquid assets. What I found was deeply alarming. He handed a stack of papers to the court clerk, who passed them up to the judge. These are credit card statements and rental history reports. Andre lied without blinking. They clearly show that Sienna is drowning in debt. She owes tens of thousands of dollars in high-interest credit card debt. She has multiple delinquent accounts and has faced several eviction notices over the past few years. She is a massive financial liability. I watched him present the fraudulent documents without reacting. I knew exactly what they were doing. The papers were either heavily manipulated or completely fabricated. They had likely stolen the financial records of a different Sienna Carmichael, betting on the fact that I would be too poor and intimidated to hire a forensic accountant to challenge them. They thought I was still the scared teenager they had bullied out of the house. Judge Warren adjusted his reading glasses and flipped through the fake documents. He was an older man who clearly admired my father's local business standing. I could see the disdain settling into his features as he looked down at me from his high bench. "Miss Carmichael," the judge said, his tone dripping with condescension. "The evidence presented here is highly troubling. A trust of this magnitude requires a beneficiary with impeccable financial responsibility. Given your apparent instability and your lack of higher education, I am strongly inclined to agree with your father. Handing over millions to someone who cannot manage basic personal finances is not only irresponsible, it borders on negligence." Richard puffed out his chest, casting a triumphant glare in my direction. In the gallery, Felicity actually let out a small, victorious laugh while Diane patted her husband's shoulder. Andre stood beside my father, crossing his arms and giving me a pitying look that made my blood boil. They thought they had buried me. They thought they had successfully severed me from my grandfather's legacy. Judge Warren reached for his heavy wooden gavel, clearing his throat to deliver the final ruling that would strike my name from the trust forever. The room held its breath, waiting for the sound of wood striking wood to seal my fate. "Before that gavel falls, Your Honor," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the courtroom. The sound was sharp, carrying an authority that made the court reporter look up from her transcript machine. Judge Warren froze his gavel, hovering an inch above the sounding block. He peered down at me, his bushy eyebrows drawing together in a deep frown. "Miss Carmichael," the judge warned, his tone laced with impatience, "you have had ample opportunity to secure legal counsel. Interrupting a ruling is highly unorthodox. Unless you have pertinent legally binding evidence to counter your family's claims, I suggest you sit down." I did not sit down. Instead, I picked up my sleek leather briefcase, the one custom made for me in Milan, and stepped out from behind the respondent's table. I walked toward the bench with slow, deliberate steps. My heels clicked against the polished marble floor, echoing in the cavernous room. "I do have evidence, Your Honor," I replied, keeping my gaze locked on his. "And it directly pertains to the wildly inaccurate financial profile my brother-in-law just presented to this court." Andre let out a loud theatrical scoff. He leaned against the plaintiff's table, shaking his head. "She has nothing, Your Honor. She is stalling. She probably typed up a fake resume at the public library this morning." My father Richard crossed his arms over his chest. "Sienna, stop embarrassing yourself. You are wasting the court's time. Accept the ruling with whatever tiny shred of dignity you have left." I ignored them both. Reaching into my briefcase, I pulled out a thick bound folder bearing the official red-embossed seal of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. I handed the original to the bailiff, who eyed it carefully before passing it up to the judge's bench. I then pulled out a duplicate copy and dropped it onto the plaintiff's table right in front of Andre and my father. It landed with a satisfying heavy thud. Andre was absolutely correct about one specific detail in his creative presentation, I said, turning to face my family. The smug smiles on Diane and Felicity's faces in the gallery began to falter. "I do not pay rent. I have not paid a single dime of rent in over 7 years. "See?" my father interrupted, eagerly pointing a finger at me. "She admits it. She is a vagrant living off handouts." "I do not pay rent," I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register, "because I buy the buildings. In fact, Andre, if you check page 42 of the document in front of you, You will see that my firm recently acquired the luxury commercial high-rise where you currently lease your very expensive, very heavily mortgaged penthouse. Andre stared at me. He looked down at the thick document on the table, hesitating for a fraction of a second before flipping it open. "What is this?" Andre demanded, though his voice lacked its previous booming confidence. He scanned the first page, his eyes darting back and forth across the dense legal text. "That is a heavily redacted SEC Form ADV, along with our latest quarterly ownership declarations." I explained clearly, making sure the court reporter caught every single word. "I am not a high school dropout searching for handouts. My name is Sienna Carmichael. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Carmichael in Black." A sharp gasp echoed from the gallery. I did not need to turn around to know it came from Diane. Anyone who read the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times knew the name Carmichael and Black. We were a ruthless private equity firm, known for aggressive leveraged buyouts, corporate restructuring, and acquiring distressed assets. We managed billions. We did not play games, and we certainly did not tolerate fraud. My father's face contorted in disbelief. He looked at Andre demanding an explanation, but Andre was entirely frozen. The CFO of the Carmichael real estate empire was currently staring at federal documents proving that the sister-in-law he had just mocked was a titan of the financial industry. "This is impossible," my father stammered, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "Carmichael and Black is a massive hedge fund. You are a child who ran away from home. You have no degree. You have no backing." "I did not need your backing, Richard," I replied, dropping the title of father entirely. "I went to the trenches of Wall Street at 18. I started as a clerk, learned the market, and leveraged my mind while you leveraged your inherited properties. I built a financial fortress while you were busy buying designer handbags for Felicity." I turned my attention back to the bench. Judge Warren had put on his reading glasses. He was poring over the SEC filings, his eyes widening as he read the staggering numbers detailing my firm's assets under management. He looked at the federal seals, the verifiable tax identification numbers, and the irrefutable proof of my identity as the sole majority shareholder. "Your Honor," I said smoothly, stepping closer to the bench, "the credit card statements and rental histories Mr. Washington presented to you today are entirely fabricated. Submitting forged documents to a probate court to deliberately disinherit a lawful beneficiary is perjury. It is also a felony. I am fully prepared to bring the full weight of my firm's legal department down upon anyone who attempts to steal my grandfather's legacy." The courtroom was dead silent. The suffocating arrogance that my family had marched in with had evaporated, replaced by a thick, choking atmosphere of panic. Andre swallowed hard, stepping away from the table as if the documents I had given him were radioactive. Felicity had stopped snapping her gum. Judge Warren slowly lowered the SEC filing. He took off his reading glasses and let them fall to his desk. The condescending smirk he had worn just 5 minutes ago was completely gone. He looked down at the fake, flimsy credit card printouts Andre had submitted, then back at the ironclad federal documents proving I controlled an empire worth exponentially more than the trust we were fighting over. He looked up, his gaze bypassing me entirely to fixate on the pale, trembling figure of my father. "Mr. Carmichael," the judge stated, his voice completely devoid of its former warmth, "do you realize who your daughter actually is?" My father opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The ruddy color that usually painted his cheeks had completely drained away, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified old man. He gripped the edge of the plaintiff table so hard his knuckles turned white. "Your Honor," my father finally stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of the undeniable federal documents resting on the judge's bench. "This is an elaborate trick. She is lying. She has to be lying." I did not even look at him. I kept my eyes fixed on the judge. "The United States government does not lie on a Form ADV, Your Honor, neither do I. The only fraud in this courtroom is standing directly to my left." Judge Warren flipped through the pages again, his expression hardening into a mask of pure judicial fury. He looked at the flimsy, fabricated credit card statements Andre had submitted earlier, then looked at the ironclad SEC filings proving my status as a titan of Wall Street. The contrast was humiliating. I strongly suggest you tread very carefully, Mr. Carmichael. Judge Warren warned, his voice echoing like thunder in the silent room. Perjury is a severe offense. Attempting to weaponize my courtroom with forged documents to disinherit a lawful beneficiary will earn you a prison sentence. He is not just trying to disinherit me, Your Honor. I interjected smoothly, taking a few steps closer to the center of the room. I unclasped the second latch on my briefcase. He is trying to rob the trust to save himself from total financial ruin. I pulled out a sleek black binder and handed it to the bailiff. I would like to enter Respondent's Exhibit B into the record. Andre lunged forward, his sophisticated facade entirely shattered, sweat beaded on his forehead. You cannot submit unverified financial records without prior discovery, Andre protested, his voice rising in panic. Your Honor, I object. Overruled, Judge Warren snapped without hesitation, snatching the binder from the bailiff. Considering you just submitted fraudulent documents to my clerk, Mr. Washington, you are in no position to lecture this court on procedure. Proceed, Miss Carmichael. I turned to face my father. He looked like a man standing on the gallows. Let us talk about the Carmichael Real Estate Group, I said, projecting my voice so it carried clear to the gallery where Diane and Felicity were sitting. For the last 5 years, my father has paraded around New York projecting the image of an untouchable billionaire developer. He threw lavish galas, bought luxury vehicles for his favored daughter, and expanded his lifestyle. But the commercial real estate sector shifted, office spaces emptied out, interest rates skyrocketed, and my father made a fatal error. He heavily over-leveraged his primary assets to fund luxury developments that never broke ground. A sharp gasp echoed from the gallery. Diane clutched her pearl necklace, her eyes darting frantically between me and her husband. Felicity sat frozen, her jaw slack, the reality of her impending poverty finally beginning to dawn on her. You took out massive mezzanine loans, I continued, closing the distance between me and my father. Short-term high-interest loans meant to bridge the gap until your new properties became profitable. But they never did. You defaulted on 3 separate massive loans last quarter. Your total liabilities amount to exactly $30 million. My father looked like he might collapse. He reached out to grab Andre for support, but his chief financial officer was too busy staring at the floor, realizing that his own career was tied to a sinking ship. When the banks classified your loans as toxic, distressed assets, they did what banks always do. I said, my voice cold and calculated. They bundled them and sold them off on the secondary market to the highest bidder. They wanted to wash their hands of your failures, and Carmichael and Black was the highest bidder. I let that sink in. I let the absolute horror of the situation wash over him. We bought your debt for pennies on the dollar, I stated, delivering the final blow. I own your debt, Richard. I own the mortgages on your commercial high-rises. I own the loans on your undeveloped lots. If I issue a capital call tomorrow morning, your entire empire will be liquidated by noon. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. The balance of power had not just shifted, it had been entirely obliterated. I had walked into this room as a supposed victim, and I had just revealed myself as the executioner. I turned my back on my father and faced Judge Warren. The judge was reading through the financial ledgers in the black binder, shaking his head in disgust as he saw the undeniable proof of my father's insolvency. This entire hearing is a masquerade, Your Honor, I declared, my tone ringing with absolute authority. My father did not drag me to probate court because he fears I will squander my grandfather's $50 million trust. He brought me here because he is drowning. He is desperate for liquidity. He intended to strip me of my 25% share, consolidate total control over the estate, and raid my grandfather's trust to pay off the $30 million he owes my firm. He orchestrated this entire charade, complete with forged credit reports, to rob his own daughter just to save his bankrupt company. Judge Warren slammed the binder shut. His face was flushed with righteous anger. He glared at my father and Andre with a look of absolute contempt. This is an outrage, the judge bellowed, his voice cracking like a whip. You have attempted to use this court to facilitate a massive financial crime. You submitted fabricated documents, you lied under oath, you tried to defraud a lawful heir to cover your own gross incompetence. Your Honor, please! My father begged, his voice trembling as he finally found his words. She is trying to destroy her own family. You destroyed your family the day you threw an 18-year-old girl onto the street. I shot back, my voice unwavering. I am just conducting business. Judge Warren picked up his heavy wooden gavel. He looked at me with newfound respect, then turned his furious gaze back to the plaintiff's table. I have heard more than enough, Judge Warren announced. I am dismissing the plaintiff's petition to remove Sienna Carmichael from this trust with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, I am confirming Miss Carmichael's rightful 25% share of this estate, effective immediately. And let me assure you, Mr. Carmichael, I will be forwarding these forged documents to the district attorney's office to consider charges of perjury and fraud. Diane let out a loud, dramatic wail from the gallery. Felicity dropped her designer handbag, the expensive leather slapping against the hardwood floor. They had walked in expecting to watch me lose everything, and instead, they were watching their entire luxurious lifestyle evaporate into thin air. Judge Warren raised his gavel high into the air, ready to strike the sounding block and finalize his ruling. He was ready to seal my victory and end my father's desperate scheme once and for all. But just as the wooden mallet began its descent, chaos erupted at the plaintiff's table. Andre Washington practically threw himself over the wooden barrier. He slammed his hands down on the table, his eyes wide with wild, frantic desperation. The smooth, arrogant CFO was gone, replaced by a man fighting for his literal survival. "Wait, Your Honor, stop!" Andre shouted, his voice echoing frantically across the courtroom. "We have an emergency motion to file." Judge Warren froze his gavel suspended midair. The absolute silence of the courtroom was shattered by the sound of Andre scrambling to his feet, his tailored suit jacket riding up as he desperately waved a thick manila envelope over the wooden barrier. "Mr. Washington," the judge growled, his face reddening with fresh irritation, "you are already on the verge of being held in contempt. This had better not be another piece of fabricated financial fiction, or I will have the bailiffs escort you to a holding cell right now." "It is not a financial record, Your Honor," Andre insisted, his voice breathless. The smooth, calculated demeanor of the corporate CFO had completely vanished. He ripped open the envelope, his dark hands shaking slightly as he pulled out a folded piece of heavy, cream-colored legal paper. "It is a durable power of attorney, signed by the deceased Josiah Carmichael exactly 3 days before his passing." A collective murmur swept through the gallery. My lead counsel, Attorney Pierce, immediately stood up, buttoning his jacket with a sharp, aggressive movement. "Objection, Your Honor." Pierce barked, his voice ringing with authority. "This is an outrageous procedural violation. The plaintiffs are attempting to introduce entirely unverified, unvetted documents at the 11th hour, only because their primary argument has been completely dismantled. This document was never produced during discovery. We just found it last night." Andre shot back, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. He looked at my father, who was suddenly breathing heavily, a desperate glimmer of hope reigniting in his eyes. "It was locked in a private safe deposit box that Richard only gained access to yesterday afternoon. This document grants Richard Carmichael absolute, irrevocable authority over the entirety of the estate, superseding any previous trust conditions or fractional distributions." I stared at the piece of paper trembling in Andre's hand. My grandfather was a meticulous, sharp-minded man who despised my father's reckless business practices. He had spent the last 5 years of his life systematically structuring his trust to ensure Richard could not liquidate the core assets. The idea that he would suddenly sign over absolute control 3 days before his death, while heavily medicated and slipping in and out of consciousness, was absurd. It was a forgery. It had to be. "Bring that document to the bench immediately," Judge Warren commanded, his tone lethal. The bailiff snatched the paper from Andre and handed it up to the judge. I watched Judge Warren put his reading glasses back on his eyes, scanning the heavy parchment. The courtroom was agonizingly still. I could hear Diane letting out a shaky breath of relief behind me while Felicity whispered something excitedly to her mother. They thought they had found their magic shield. "Your Honor, I demand to inspect that document," Attorney Pierce stated, stepping up to the bench. Judge Warren handed the paper down. Pierce scrutinized it for several long seconds, his jaw tightening. He walked back to our table and placed it in front of me. I looked down at the signature. It looked like my grandfather's handwriting, possessing the same sharp loops and heavy downward strokes. But there was a noticeable tremor to the ink, a hesitation that spoke of someone trying too hard to trace an outline. Beneath the signature sat a bright, freshly stamped notary seal. "It has a certified notary stamp," Pierce whispered to me, his tone grim. "And it is dated 72 hours before he died." "He was on a morphine drip 72 hours before he died," I whispered back, my eyes fixed on the forged ink. He could barely hold a glass of water, let alone execute a complex legal maneuver reversing years of estate planning. Richard paid someone to stamp this. Pierce nodded, turning his attention back to the judge. "Your Honor, we formally challenge the authenticity of this document. Its sudden appearance is highly suspect, and given the plaintiff's prior submission of fraudulent credit reports today, this court has zero reason to presume this power of attorney is genuine. We request an immediate forensic handwriting analysis and a deposition of the notary public whose seal appears on this page." "I welcome the analysis," Andre interrupted, though his voice wavered just a fraction. He stood taller, trying to regain his footing as an executive. "The document is legally binding. Until it is proven otherwise, Richard Carmichael retains absolute authority over the trust. You cannot rule against him today." I looked at my father. The terrified hollow man from 5 minutes ago was slowly disappearing. Richard straightened his posture, adjusting his silk tie, the arrogant, entitled CEO returning to the surface. He knew exactly what he was doing. He did not need this document to be permanently upheld. He only needed it to buy him time. Judge Warren rubbed his temples, clearly disgusted by the blatant legal gamesmanship happening in his courtroom. He looked at me with an expression of genuine apology. "Miss Carmichael," the judge said heavily, "my hands are tied by procedure. A certified, notarized, durable power of attorney carries an automatic presumption of validity under state law until challenged and proven fraudulent through proper evidentiary channels. Your Honor, he is going to use this delay to liquidate the assets and pay off his corporate debts," I warned, keeping my voice steady despite the surge of frustration burning in my chest. "If you do not freeze this estate, there will be nothing left to argue over by the time the ink is analyzed." "I am well aware of the risks," Judge Warren replied sharply. He raised his gavel. "I am suspending this probate hearing for exactly 30 days. I am ordering an immediate independent forensic analysis of this document. Furthermore, I am placing a strict court-mandated injunction on the $50 million trust. No assets may be liquidated, transferred, or leveraged by anyone, including Mr. Carmichael, until the authenticity of this document is verified. We will reconvene in 1 month." The heavy wooden gavel slammed down. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot, signaling a temporary stalemate. The judge stood and swept out of the courtroom, his robes billowing behind him. The immediate danger to my inheritance had been paused, but the war was far from over. Attorney Pierce began packing his files into his briefcase. "We have 30 days, Sienna," he muttered. "I will get our investigators on that notary immediately. We will rip their lives apart until we find out who they bribed to stamp that paper." "Do it," I replied coldly, my eyes locked on the plaintiff's table. "Find the weakest link." Across the aisle, Andre was packing away his fabricated documents, letting out a long, ragged exhale. Diane and Felicity were already standing up, their faces glowing with renewed arrogance. They had survived the ambush. I grabbed my briefcase and turned to leave. As I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, my father stepped out from his table, deliberately blocking my path. Richard looked down at me, his eyes dark with a venomous, unhinged fury. He leaned in close, ensuring that neither my lawyers nor the bailiffs could hear his words. The smell of expensive scotch and nervous sweat radiated off him. "You thought you could walk in here and humiliate me?" My father whispered, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. "You thought your Wall Street money made you untouchable. You are nothing but a little girl playing a grown man's game." I did not step back. I met his gaze with absolute chilling calm. "I am the woman who owns your company's debt, Richard," I reminded him softly. "You bought yourself 30 days. Enjoy them." Richard sneered, a cruel, mocking smile stretching across his face. 30 days is all I need, he whispered, stepping aside to let me pass. You will be destroyed before you ever see a single dime. I walked past him without breaking my stride. The heavy courthouse doors swung shut behind me, sealing my father and his desperate threats inside. I did not look back. I climbed into the back of my waiting town car, the tinted windows shielding me from the chaotic afternoon traffic. As the driver navigated toward Manhattan, I pulled out my phone and dialed Attorney Pierce. I instructed him to tear apart the life of the notary who stamped that fraudulent power of attorney. I wanted bank records, communication logs, and travel history. If my father bribed an official to forge a legal document 72 hours before my grandfather died, there would be a paper trail. Pierce assured me his investigators were already mobilizing. By the time I reached my Wall Street penthouse, the adrenaline from the courtroom had settled into a cold, calculating focus. My apartment was a multi-million-dollar sanctuary of floor-to-ceiling glass-polished steel and minimalist art perched high above the financial district. It was a fortress paid for by my own sweat late nights and ruthless financial maneuvering. I poured myself a single glass of bourbon, looking out over the glittering skyline. My father had promised to destroy me in 30 days. I expected him to file injunctions, attempt to freeze my corporate assets, or launch a hostile counterbid against my firm. I expected a financial war. What I did not expect was a full-scale assassination of my character. My phone started ringing at 4 in the morning. I ignored the first two calls, but when the specialized ringtone for my chief communications officer chimed through the dark bedroom, I sat up instantly. David never called before dawn, unless the firm was actively bleeding capital. I answered the call. David sounded breathless and panicked. He told me to turn on my tablet and open every major financial gossip blog, digital tabloid, and social media aggregator in the city. I grabbed my tablet from the nightstand. The headlines hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The runaway gold digger, how one woman slept her way to a Wall Street empire. Carmichael and Black CEO, accused of corporate extortion and elder abuse. From high school dropout to hedge fund hustler, the dark past of Sienna Carmichael. I clicked on the leading article from a notoriously vicious digital tabloid. The story was a masterpiece of character assassination, perfectly crafted to destroy my credibility in the hyper-conservative world of private equity. According to anonymous sources closely tied to the Carmichael family, I was not a self-made financial prodigy. The article painted me as a manipulative, unstable runaway who had been kicked out of my family home at 18 for severe moral failings and substance issues. But the smear went much deeper. The sources claimed that I had acquired the initial capital to launch Carmichael and Black by seducing and extorting older, vulnerable Wall Street executives. They alleged that my entire firm was a house of cards built on blackmail and illicit favors. To make matters worse, the article detailed the ongoing probate court battle, spinning the narrative entirely in my father's favor. It stated that I had returned from a 15-year exile specifically to harass my ailing bankrupt father and steal my severely disabled grandfather's trust fund. I scrolled down to the embedded photographs. There were candid, zoomed-in pictures of me arguing with my father outside a restaurant years ago, completely stripped of context. There were quotes from unnamed high society figures expressing shock at my greed. I knew exactly who engineered this: Diane and Felicity. My stepmother and half-sister had leveraged their country club connections and paid off predatory PR firms to plant these stories overnight. Felicity had always been obsessed with social media and public image. While Richard and Andre tried to fight me with forged legal documents, Diane and Felicity had chosen to fight dirty in the court of public opinion. They knew they could not beat me financially, so they decided to make me toxic. In the world of high finance, perception is reality. Institutional investors, pension funds, and sovereign wealth portfolios do not park billions of dollars with a CEO embroiled in a sordid public scandal involving elder abuse and corporate blackmail. David was practically shouting through the phone speaker. He informed me that the story had already gone viral across major financial forums. Rival firms were sharing the links. Institutional clients were sending urgent emails demanding clarification. In the span of 3 hours, Diane and Felicity had successfully weaponized the internet against my firm. "We are drafting a cease and desist right now," David said urgently. "We are preparing a defamation suit against the publishers." But Sienna, the damage is moving faster than our legal response. Our limited partners are spooked. The Saudi investors just suspended their capital commitment for the upcoming tech buyout. I gripped the edge of the marble kitchen island, my knuckles turning white. My father had not been bluffing. He intended to destroy my livelihood so entirely that I would be forced to settle the probate case just to save my firm. He wanted to drain my power before the 30-day court suspension expired. Before I could formulate a response to David, my secondary secure business line began to ring. It was a direct connection reserved exclusively for the board of directors of Carmichael and Black. I put David on hold and switched lines. The gruff, unforgiving voice of Maxwell, the chairman of the board, echoed through the receiver. He did not bother with pleasantries. "Sienna, I am looking at a public relations catastrophe that is currently threatening $10 billion in active managed assets," Maxwell stated coldly. "The board has been fielding calls from terrified investors since 5 in the morning. Your family drama has just become a massive corporate liability." "The articles are completely fabricated, Maxwell," I replied, forcing my voice to remain calm and authoritative. "It is a coordinated smear campaign initiated by my father's desperate attempts to cover up his own corporate bankruptcy. I have my legal team preparing a massive defamation strike." "I do not care if it is a fairy tale," Maxwell snapped back. "Our stock valuation is taking a hit in the pre-market trading. The optics of our CEO being accused of sleeping her way to startup capital and extorting a dying grandfather are radioactive. We cannot have the face of Carmichael in Black plastered across the tabloids like a cheap reality television star." I closed my eyes, feeling the sheer magnitude of the trap my family had sprung on me. "We are convening an emergency board meeting in exactly 1 hour," Maxwell announced, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. "You need to have an airtight strategy to kill this story and restore investor confidence immediately. If you cannot contain this fallout before the market officially opens, the board is prepared to trigger the morality clause in your contract." He paused, letting the threat hang heavy in the air. "Fix this, Sienna," Maxwell warned, "or we will vote to remove you as chief executive officer by noon." The line went completely dead. The dial tone echoed in the silent glass-enclosed living room of my penthouse. I set the phone down on the cold marble kitchen counter. A lesser executive would have panicked. A weaker woman would have packed her bags and begged for a settlement. But I had survived being thrown out onto the freezing streets of New York with nothing but the clothes on my back. A board of angry conservative old men and a coordinated smear campaign were not going to break me. I poured the rest of my bourbon down the sink, splashing the amber liquid against the stainless steel drain. It was time to go to war. My personal cell phone vibrated, sliding an inch across the polished stone. I glanced at the screen. A text message notification popped up from a number I had blocked years ago. However, my firm's secure server had routed it through a secondary channel, bypassing my standard filters. It was Felicity. She was entirely too eager to gloat. "Did you read the morning news, sis? Looks like your little Wall Street fairy tale is crashing down. Mom and I thought the gold digger angle was a really nice touch. Do not bother coming to court next month. You are finished." I stared at the glowing screen. She was foolish. Extreme arrogance always made my family incredibly sloppy. I picked up the device and typed back a measured, deliberate response, knowing exactly how to bait her trap. "Libel is a very dangerous game, Felicity. You and Diane are exposing yourselves to massive financial liability." The typing bubble appeared immediately. Felicity was far too hot-headed to resist the provocation. She had been handed everything her entire life, making her utterly blind to legal consequences. "Prove it," she texted back. "Everyone believes us, because you have always been trash. You could not even finish college. You are a high school dropout who got lucky, and now everyone in your precious financial district knows it." "I dropped out because Richard drained my entire college savings account," I replied, keeping the digital bait dangling right in front of her. "And we both know exactly where that money went." I waited. 10 seconds later, her response flooded the screen in a massive block of text exactly as I had anticipated. She could never help but brag about her unearned privilege. "Oh, are you still crying about that? Get over it, Sienna. It was $250,000. Daddy knew investing it in my wedding to Andre was a much better use of family funds than wasting it on a useless degree for a failure. My wedding was the social event of the decade. We had 500 guests. We imported white orchids from France and served caviar. You were just a bad investment. Daddy chose the daughter who actually mattered." I read the words twice, letting the cold reality of her confession settle over me. The memory of that day hit me like a physical strike, but I shoved the emotion aside. I was 18 years old when I went to the bank to pay my first semester's tuition, only to find the custodial account completely emptied. My father, who had retained total administrative control over the funds, had liquidated every single cent. When I confronted him in his home office, he simply laughed. He told me Felicity was marrying a rising corporate star, Andre Washington, and the Carmichael family needed to project immense wealth to secure their social standing. My future, my education, and my basic stability were sacrificed for an ice sculpture and a 5-tier cake. When I demanded the money back, Diane gleefully packed my bags and told me to get out. I did not type back a furious response. I did not hurl my phone across the room or shed a single tear. Emotion is a fatal liability in corporate warfare. Instead, I pressed the side buttons on my device, capturing high-resolution screenshots of the entire text exchange. I captured her clear admission of coordinating the public relations smear campaign. I captured her gleeful confession about my father misappropriating my college funds to finance her lavish wedding to Andre. I archived the images, encrypted the file, and forwarded it directly to Attorney Pierce and my personal legal vault on the firm's mainframe. Felicity thought she was inflicting emotional damage, but she had just handed me written proof of malicious intent and financial manipulation. The board meeting was in less than an hour. Maxwell wanted an airtight strategy to kill the media story. But fighting a public relations battle against anonymous sources was a game of whack-a-mole. It was purely defensive, and I did not play defense. I needed leverage so devastating that my father would be forced to publicly retract the smear campaign himself. To destroy a king, you do not attack the castle walls. You compromise the royal treasurer. I picked up my secure business line and bypassed David entirely. I dialed the direct extension for Elias, my lead forensic financial analyst. Elias was a brilliant, ruthless operative who could track a single dollar bill through a dozen offshore shell companies without leaving a trace. "Elias, drop whatever portfolio you are analyzing right now," I commanded the moment he answered. "I need a total unrestricted deep dive into a specific target. I want you to pull every financial record, every tax filing, and every corporate expense report attached to Andre Washington, the chief financial officer of the Carmichael Real Estate Group." "Understood?" Boss Elias replied, the rapid clacking of a mechanical keyboard already echoing in the background. "What exactly am I looking for?" "Andre is a man who likes expensive suits, high-stakes risks, and maintaining the illusion of absolute control," I stated, my eyes locked on the digital skyline shining outside my window. "Men like that always have secrets they cannot afford to expose. I want you to find every shadow account, every hidden crypto wallet, and every off-the-books transaction tied to his name. Find his breaking point, Elias. We are going to make him bleed." Elias did not hesitate. His keystrokes were a relentless drumbeat in the background as I hung up the phone. I knew the kind of financial damage Andre could inflict while the probate court suspension dragged on. He was the chief financial officer of the Carmichael Real Estate Group, meaning he had his hands on the levers of my family's remaining capital, and he was about to use them. The retaliation began the very next morning. I was reviewing an acquisition portfolio in my office when my executive assistant Marcus walked in with a grim expression. He handed me a stack of urgent notices from 3 different financial institutions. Andre had weaponized the forged power of attorney. Using the document's broad legal authority, he had successfully petitioned the banks to freeze every personal account, trust disbursement, and secondary asset tied to the Carmichael family name that still bore my social security number. It was a classic squeeze play. Andre assumed I was heavily reliant on the family trust to maintain my lifestyle, just like Felicity. He was trying to bleed me out, cutting off my liquid assets to force a desperate settlement before the 30-day court injunction expired. He fundamentally misunderstood the structure of my wealth. My personal assets were entirely insulated within the corporate structure of Carmichael and Black. He had frozen accounts that I had not touched since I was a teenager. It was a pathetic, empty gesture, but it confirmed my strategy. Andre was terrified, and terrified men make mistakes. By late afternoon, Marcus brought me a formal invitation hand-delivered by a courier. It was an invitation to dinner at the St. Regis Country Club signed by Andre Washington. The note attached was smooth and conciliatory, suggesting a private meeting to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution without the exhausting theater of the courtroom. He was playing the rational peacemaker, attempting to divide and conquer by separating me from my legal team. I accepted the invitation immediately. I needed to look him in the eye when I closed the trap. The St. Regis Country Club was a bastion of old money, all dark wood paneling, leather chairs, and hushed conversations. I arrived precisely on time, wearing a structured navy suit that screamed Wall Street authority. Andre was already seated at a secluded table in the back of the dining room. He wore a bespoke gray suit, sipping an expensive scotch. He stood up when I approached, offering a charming practiced smile that completely ignored the fact that we were engaged in a vicious legal war. "Sienna," he said smoothly, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Thank you for coming. I ordered the 2010 Barolo. I remember you having a taste for bold reds." I sat down, ignoring the wine glass. "Let us skip the pleasantries, Andre. You did not freeze my dormant bank accounts and invite me to a country club to discuss vintage wine. You are trying to establish leverage." Andre chuckled, leaning back in his chair. He was trying to project the image of a seasoned executive handling a difficult subordinate. "I am trying to save this family from a public, drawn-out bloodbath, Sienna. Your father is a proud man. He made mistakes, yes. But going to war against your own blood is a losing proposition for everyone involved. The media circus is already damaging both our reputations." He was referencing the PR smear campaign Diane and Felicity had launched, attempting to use the chaos they created as a bargaining chip. "I am entirely unbothered by tabloid gossip, Andre," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. "My investors care about returns, not family drama." My stock price rebounded before lunch. "But tell me, how is the Carmichael Real Estate Group handling the news that their primary assets are heavily overleveraged and their CEO is facing perjury charges?" Andre's smile tightened, the edges of his sophisticated facade beginning to fray. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Listen to me, Sienna. The power of attorney is legally binding. The 30-day suspension gives us more than enough time to maneuver. If we go back to court, it will be a grinding, multi-year litigation process. The legal fees alone will drain the trust. Your father is prepared to fight until the bitter end. He will burn it all down before he hands you a quarter of his empire." He paused, letting the threat settle in the quiet dining room. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a crisp white envelope. He slid it slowly across the polished wood table until it rested right in front of me. "I am offering you an out," Andre said, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "Inside that envelope is a certified cashier's check for $1 million. Clean, untraceable capital. No strings attached to the family business." He leaned back again, steepling his fingers. He thought he was offering me a fortune. He thought he was offering a runaway the ultimate prize. "Take the check, Sienna. Drop the lawsuit. Sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement regarding your father's finances and walk away from this family forever. You get a massive payday and we stop the bleeding. It is a win for everyone." I let Andre's words hang in the air for a moment. He truly believed he was in control. He genuinely thought that $1 million check and a few veiled threats would be enough to send me scurrying back into the shadows. It was almost insulting how little he understood who he was dealing with. I didn't reach for the envelope. I didn't even look at it. Instead, I placed my hands flat on the polished mahogany table and leaned in, my gaze locked on his. "You're offering me $1 million," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. From a company that is $30 million in debt, a company whose primary assets are underwater, a company that I now hold the mortgages for. Tell me, Andre, where exactly did you get $1 million in clean, untraceable capital? Andre's confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The Carmichael Real Estate Group has significant operational reserves, he replied smoothly, though I could hear the slight tension in his voice. I authorized the disbursement to protect the long-term stability of the trust. Operational reserves, I repeated, letting a small, cold smile touch my lips. That's a fascinating term. Elias had a different name for it when he finished analyzing your personal financial footprint this afternoon. I unlatched my briefcase and pulled out a thick black manila envelope. It was far heavier than the one Andre had slid across the table. I dropped it in front of him. Go ahead, I instructed, nodding toward the envelope. Open it. Andre hesitated, his eyes darting from the envelope to my face. The facade of the polished executive was cracking, replaced by a growing, unmistakable unease. He reached out with a trembling hand, broke the seal, and slid the contents onto the table. The first thing to fall out was a stack of high-definition 8x10 glossy photographs. They were not corporate headshots or family vacation pictures. They were grainy surveillance-style images, but the subject was undeniable. Andre stared down at a photo of himself sitting at a green baize table, a massive stack of chips piled in front of him. He was not in a boardroom. He was in a dimly lit smoky room. Another photo showed him handing a thick envelope of cash to a man with a heavily tattooed neck. A third captured him looking desperate and disheveled, standing outside an unmarked door in an alleyway. Las Vegas is a very unforgiving city, Andre, I said softly, watching the color drain completely from his face. Especially the underground rooms, the ones that don't ask for ID, but definitely ask for collateral. Andre's hands shook as he shuffled through the photos. He tried to speak, but only a strangled gasp escaped his throat. Elias is a very thorough analyst, I continued, leaning back in my chair. When I asked him to look into your finances, I expected to find some creative accounting, maybe a few inflated expense reports or a hidden bonus structure. I did not expect to find a $5 million hole in the Carmichael Real Estate Group's operational ledger. Andre's head snapped up. His eyes were wide with absolute terror. Sienna, listen to me. No, you listen to me. I cut him off, my voice sharp and commanding. You are the chief financial officer. You have unparalleled access to the corporate accounts. You thought you could cover your losses by quietly siphoning funds, moving them through a labyrinth of shell companies and converting them into cryptocurrency. You thought you were untraceable. I reached into the envelope and pulled out a stack of financial flowcharts and digital ledger transcripts. I spread them across the table, covering his $1 million check. These are the blockchain transactions, Andre, I stated, tapping the papers. Elias tracked every single transfer. We know exactly when you moved the money from the Carmichael accounts to an offshore crypto wallet based in the Cayman Islands. We know exactly when that wallet dispersed funds to 3 separate high-stakes gambling syndicates in Nevada. Andre slumped back in his chair, looking as if the air had been violently knocked out of his lungs. The polished, arrogant man who had tried to buy me off 5 minutes ago was gone, replaced by a desperate, broken gambler facing total ruin. You didn't just embezzle $5 million, I said, leaning closer, ensuring my words carried maximum impact. You stole from a bankrupt company. You stole from a man who is already $30 million in debt. You stole from your father-in-law. I let the silence stretch, allowing the sheer magnitude of his situation to crush him. You brought me here to offer me $1 million of my own family's money, I whispered, shaking my head in disgust. Money you stole to cover up the fact that you stole even more. Andre looked frantically around the dining room, as if expecting the police to burst through the doors at any moment. He wiped a hand across his sweating face. Sienna, you don't understand. I was trying to win it back. The market shifted. Richard was demanding impossible returns, and I got in too deep. I just needed one big win to cover the margins. I don't care about your justifications, I replied coldly. I care about leverage, and right now I hold all of it. I gathered the photographs and the financial transcripts, tapping them neatly into a stack. I slid them back into the black envelope. What do you think Richard will do when I send him these? I asked, a dangerous smile spreading across my face. He won't just fire you, Andre. He will destroy you. He will press criminal charges for embezzlement. He will drag your name through the mud to explain his own bankruptcy. He will ensure you never work in finance again, and he will make sure Felicity divorces you and leaves you with nothing. Andre stared at me, his eyes wide and pleading. The realization of his impending doom was absolute. He wasn't just facing professional ruin, he was facing federal prison. Please, Andre whispered, his voice cracking. Please, Sienna. If Richard sees those, he'll kill me. I know he will, I replied, my voice devoid of any sympathy. Richard does not tolerate failure, and he certainly does not tolerate theft from his own pockets. He will make a brutal public example out of you to distract from his own impending bankruptcy. Andre grabbed the edge of the mahogany table. His knuckles were bone white. The ambient noise of the country club, the clinking silverware, and the hushed aristocratic conversations seemed entirely disconnected from the absolute destruction happening at our table. Sienna, you cannot do this, he begged, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. Felicity will leave me. My career will be over. I will go to a federal penitentiary for wire fraud. You should have considered the federal sentencing guidelines before you wired $5 million to offshore gambling syndicates, I stated coldly. You walked into this room planning to bribe me with my own family trust. You thought you could intimidate me with a frozen bank account. You thought I was still the helpless teenager your wife used to mock. I leaned closer, invading his space until he was forced to shrink back against his leather chair. You are completely out of your depth, Andre. You are playing checkers and I own the entire board. He swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing the line of his jaw. What do you want? I can get the money back. I have assets I can liquidate. I just need time. I do not want your dirty casino money, I said, my tone lethal and precise. I want your absolute obedience. You have exactly 2 choices tonight. Choice 1, I press a button on my phone, and this entire dossier goes directly to Richard Felicity and the Financial Crimes Bureau of the District Attorney's Office. You leave this club in handcuffs by midnight. Andre squeezed his eyes shut, his sophisticated facade completely obliterated. And choice 2? Choice 2, I said softly, letting the silence hang for a fraction of a second. You work for me. He opened his eyes, a flicker of sheer confusion cutting through his blind panic. Work for you, doing what? You are going to be my eyes and ears inside the Carmichael Real Estate Group, I commanded. I know my father. I know exactly how he operates. The financial records he submitted to the probate court were sanitized. The tax returns he filed for the last decade are works of fiction. He keeps 2 sets of books, one for the government and one for reality. Andre shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the exits, as if looking for an escape route that did not exist. Richard keeps the master ledgers entirely offline. He is deeply paranoid. He only trusts me to audit the raw numbers because my own signature is on the corporate filings. Exactly, I said, tapping my manicured fingernail against the black envelope on the table. Which makes you the only person on earth who holds the key to his absolute destruction. I want the real accounting ledgers, Andre. I want the shadow books. I want every unedited spreadsheet, every secret offshore holding company, and every illegal wire transfer he has executed over the past 5 years. If I give you those books, Richard will know it was me, Andre protested, his voice dropping to an anxious, gravelly whisper. He will ruin me anyway. If you do not give me those books, I will ruin you right now, I countered. Your loyalty to my father is a sinking ship. I am offering you a lifeboat. You hand over the raw data, and when my firm hostilely takes over the Carmichael estate, I will ensure your embezzlement is quietly classified as a corporate write-off during the restructuring. You will avoid prison. You will walk away with your freedom provided you divorce my sister and never set foot on Wall Street again. It was a brutal, non-negotiable ultimatum. I was asking a corporate executive to commit the highest form of corporate treason. I was demanding that he hand over the literal blueprint to his father-in-law's financial crimes. Andre stared at the envelope containing the photos of his underground gambling. He looked at the $1 million cashier's check he had tried to bribe me with, which now looked like a worthless, pathetic piece of paper. The fight completely drained out of his body. The arrogant CFO was entirely broken, replaced by a man desperate to avoid a federal cell. He let out a long, ragged exhale. He slowly reached into his tailored suit jacket. His hand was trembling so violently he struggled to unfasten the inner pocket. He pulled out a sleek, heavy titanium USB drive. It was encrypted and lacked any identifying corporate branding. It requires a dual authentication biometric bypass, but I disabled the hardware lock before I left the office today. Andre said, his voice completely hollow. He set the drive on the table, keeping his hand flat over it, as if letting it go would seal his fate. Everything is on here. The real profit and loss statements. The shell companies he used to hide his toxic assets. The mezzanine loans he defaulted on. It is all categorized by fiscal year. I reached out and pulled the drive out from under his trembling hand. The cold metal felt heavy against my palm. This was the Holy Grail. This was the weapon that would permanently dismantle my father's empire and secure my grandfather's legacy once and for all. I slipped the drive into my briefcase and snapped the brass lock shut with a sharp, echoing click. "You made the right choice, Andre," I said, standing up from the table and smoothing out my blazer. "You will receive instructions from my legal team tomorrow regarding your sworn testimony. Do not attempt to run. Elias is monitoring your passport and your offshore bank accounts. If you try to board a plane, the FBI will be waiting for you at the gate." I turned to leave the private dining room, my victory absolute. I had dismantled my father's right-hand man in less than 20 minutes. "Sienna, wait," Andre called out from the table. I paused, looking back over my shoulder. Andre was still sitting exactly where I left him, but his expression had changed dramatically. The panic over his own criminal exposure was gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling darkness. He looked physically sick to his stomach. "You think you know what kind of man your father is?" Andre said, his voice dropping to a chilling, haunted register. "You think this is just about bad real estate investments and standard corporate greed. It is not. You do not know how sick your father really is." I narrowed my eyes, stepping back toward the table. "What are you talking about?" Andre pointed a trembling finger toward my locked briefcase. "When you open that drive, do not just look at the corporate debt. Look at the personal liabilities. Look at Felicity's accounts." I left the country club with the titanium drive feeling heavier than a vault door inside my briefcase. I did not go home to my penthouse. I directed my driver to head straight to the financial district. The sleek, glass-enclosed executive floor of Carmichael and Black was dead quiet at midnight, save for the hum of the servers and the low, intense voices in my private boardroom. Attorney Pierce was pacing the length of the room, fueled by his third cup of black coffee. Elias, my lead forensic analyst, was already plugged into the isolated, air-gapped terminal. I handed Elias the drive. The room held its breath as he executed the biometric bypass Andre had provided. Lines of encrypted code scrolled rapidly across the massive wall monitors. Within seconds, the encryption shattered. The raw, unfiltered financial soul of the Carmichael Real Estate Group spilled out in blinding high-definition data. The numbers were staggering. The $30 million in toxic debt that my firm had recently bought was just the tip of the iceberg. Richard had been running a sophisticated shell game for years, moving money between dummy corporations and offshore tax havens to project an illusion of massive corporate liquidity. "He is a dead man walking," Pierce stated, adjusting his glasses as he read the scrolling data. "These internal financial statements are completely fabricated. The moment the IRS gets wind of these offshore transfers, your father is going to a federal penitentiary." "I do not care about the tax evasion right now," I replied, standing behind Elias's chair. My mind kept looping back to the absolute terror in Andre's eyes before I walked away from his table. Andre told me to look at the personal liabilities. He explicitly told me to look at Felicity's accounts. Elias, isolate my sister's name and social security number, run a cross-reference across all the unregulated private loans on the books. Elias's fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. Files vanished, replaced by a dense, color-coded spreadsheet. The silence in the boardroom stretched, growing thicker and colder by the second. Elias stopped typing. He took a slow, heavy breath and leaned back from the monitors. "Boss," Elias said, his voice completely devoid of its usual clinical detachment. "Your father did not just mismanage his company, he committed massive systematic identity theft against his own daughter." I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my eyes scanning the heavily encrypted contracts. Pierce stepped up beside me, letting out a sharp, shocked breath. The truth was staring us right in the face in undeniable black and white. Richard Carmichael had used Felicity as a human shield. Over the past 5 years, my father had meticulously curated Felicity's financial profile. He paid off her credit cards in full. He put luxury cars and high-end real estate directly into her name. He built her a pristine high-net-worth credit score. I had always assumed it was just blind favoritism. I assumed he simply loved his golden child more than he loved me. I was entirely wrong. He was not spoiling her. He was fattening her up for the slaughter. Once Felicity's financial profile was flawless, Richard weaponized it. He forged her signature on dozens of personal guarantor agreements. When traditional banks cut him off and refused to finance his failing commercial developments, he turned to the shadow banking sector. He took out millions of dollars in unregulated high-interest mezzanine debt from predatory private lenders. And he used Felicity's pristine credit as the sole collateral. "He forged her signature on the dotted line," Pierce whispered in absolute disbelief. "He legally bound her to these high-risk loans. These private equity lenders do not care about the corporate bankruptcy. When Richard defaults, they will bypass the company entirely and go straight for the personal guarantor. They will seize everything she has," Elias added grimly. "They will take her house auction, her cars, drain her bank accounts, and garnish any future wages she ever earns. She is legally on the hook for at least $20 million. She will be forced into personal bankruptcy before she turns 30. I stared at the glowing numbers, a cold, clinical realization washing over me. Felicity walked around New York City, wearing designer brands, sipping champagne at country clubs, and mocking me for being a dropout. She thought she was a wealthy heiress, untouchable and secure in our father's empire. She had absolutely no idea that she was walking on a financial landmine. She was nothing but a collateralized debt obligation to the man she idolized. My father threw me out onto the street at 18 because I refused to be controlled. I thought it was the cruelest thing a parent could do. But looking at these ledgers, I realized my exile was my absolute salvation. He kept Felicity close, showered her with affection, and praised her obedience, all so he could harvest her identity when his empire inevitably crumbled. "Print it all," I commanded, my voice echoing with lethal precision. "Compile the signature discrepancies. Map the flow of funds from the shadow loans directly into Richard's offshore accounts. Build me a kill shot." We worked through the night. By the time the sun began to rise over the East River, casting a brilliant golden light across the Manhattan skyline, we had assembled a physical dossier of pure, unadulterated financial treason. The trap was fully constructed. We possessed the exact ammunition required to tear the Carmichael Real Estate Group down to its foundation. I took a quick shower in my executive suite, changed into a fresh, tailored charcoal suit, and ordered a double espresso. The firm was beginning to wake up. The trading floor outside my office buzzed with the aggressive high-stakes energy of Wall Street opening bells. My stock price was stabilizing. The PR smear campaign had inflicted a flesh wound, but the armor of my corporate empire held firm. I sat behind my massive mahogany desk reviewing the final printed pages of Richard's identity theft. It was 8:30 in the morning. The secure intercom on my desk suddenly lit up with a harsh, persistent buzz. I pressed the flashing button. "Yes, Gavin," I asked my executive floor receptionist. "Miss Carmichael, I am incredibly sorry to interrupt," Gavin said, his voice tense and rushed. "Building security just called up from the lobby. 2 women bypassed the main guest registry by tailgating a group of senior partners through the turnstiles. They are currently stepping off the executive elevator." Before Gavin could finish his sentence, the heavy glass doors to my outer office swung violently open. I could hear the sharp, aggressive clicking of high heels storming across the hardwood floor. "Diane and Felicity are here," Gavin said urgently, "and they are demanding to see you immediately." "Let them in, Gavin," I instructed, smoothly pressing the button on my secure intercom. Hold all my calls and do not let building security intervene. I want to hear exactly what they have to say. I leaned back in my high-backed leather chair, folding my hands together on the cool, polished surface of my mahogany desk. The heavy oak doors to my inner office flew open, hitting the rubber wall stop with a loud, aggressive thud. Diane and Felicity stumbled inside, looking completely out of place in the sleek, ultra-modern environment of a Wall Street private equity firm. They were dressed in carefully curated outfits designed to project wealthy distress. Diane wore a beige cashmere wrap clutched tightly around her shoulders, holding a crumpled lace handkerchief to her nose. Felicity looked equally frantic, her hair slightly messy, completely abandoning the polished, arrogant sneer she had worn in the probate courtroom just a day ago. "Sienna!" Diane gasped, rushing forward until she reached the edge of my desk. Her voice trembled thick with manufactured tears. "You have to stop this. You have to call off your lawyers immediately." I did not stand up. I did not offer them a seat. I simply watched them with the detached curiosity of a predator observing prey caught in a snare. "Good morning, Diane," I said, my tone as warm as the winter wind coming off the Hudson River. "It is quite a surprise to see you bypassing my security turnstiles. I assume there is a highly compelling reason for this dramatic entrance." Diane let out a theatrical sob, pressing the handkerchief to her eyes. "It is your father," she cried, her shoulders shaking with the effort of her performance. "Richard collapsed in the master bathroom this morning. He is experiencing severe chest pains. His blood pressure is dangerously high, and the doctors say his heart simply cannot take the strain of this legal battle." Felicity stepped up beside her mother, nodding vigorously. Her eyes were wide, pleading with me, in a desperate, frenzied manner. "He is dying, Sienna. The stress from the probate court suspension and those horrible articles in the tabloids are pushing him over the edge. You are killing him." It was a breathtaking performance. If I did not have a folder sitting 2 inches from my left hand, containing absolute proof that Richard had just fraudulently saddled Felicity with $20 million in shadow debt, I might have actually felt a sliver of sympathy. But I knew the truth. Richard was not having a heart attack. Richard was having a panic attack because he realized his corporate empire was a house of cards and a massive gust of wind had just entered the room. "The articles in the tabloids," I repeated, arching a single eyebrow. "You mean the exact same articles that you and Felicity paid a predatory public relations firm to publish yesterday morning? The ones that falsely accused me of corporate blackmail and elder abuse?" It is fascinating how quickly the consequences of your own smear campaign have become a tragic medical emergency. Diane stopped sobbing for a fraction of a second. Genuine shock flashed across her face before she quickly buried it back in her handkerchief. "They did not expect me to know they were the direct source of the media leak." "We did not want any of this to happen," Diane pleaded, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. "We were just scared. Your father was terrified of losing the family legacy. But we are your blood, Sienna. We are your family. You must have some shred of family loyalty left in your heart. Please, I am begging you to withdraw your claim to the trust. If you drop the lawsuit and issue a public statement of reconciliation, we can stop all this madness before your father suffers a fatal stroke." I stood up slowly, my heels planting firmly on the floor. I walked around the massive desk until I was standing just a few feet away from my stepmother and half-sister. "Family loyalty," I said, tasting the words as if they were pure poison. "You invoke family loyalty now. Where was that loyalty when you packed my bags and threw me out onto the street at 18? Where was that loyalty when you watched Richard drain my entire college savings account to buy ice sculptures for Felicity's wedding?" Felicity's face flushed a deep, angry red. The victim mask she had been wearing was beginning to crack, slipping, to reveal the spoiled, entitled child underneath. "That was 15 years ago." Felicity snapped, her voice losing its manufactured tremor. "You are clearly doing fine now. You have this massive office. You have billions of dollars. Why are you so obsessed with destroying us over a $50 million trust fund? You do not even need the money." "It is not about the money, Felicity," I replied coldly, looking her dead in the eye. "It is about the principle. It is about taking back exactly what my grandfather intended for me to have, and ensuring that thieves do not profit from my absence. Felicity stepped closer, her aggression entirely overriding her mother's tearful strategy. She slammed her hands down on the edge of my desk, her breathing heavy. "You are just a vindictive, bitter woman trying to punish us because you were jealous." Felicity spat, her voice echoing sharply in the large office. "But we can make this easy. We can make all the media scrutiny go away. Just tell us what it will take for you to walk away from the probate court." I tilted my head, studying her sudden shift in demeanor. She was pushing hard, forcing the conversation in a very specific, aggressive direction. "I have no interest in walking away," I stated plainly. "Everyone has a price." Felicity pushed back, her voice growing unnaturally loud and staged. She grabbed her heavy designer handbag and hoisted it onto the edge of my desk, leaning her weight against it to push it closer to me. "Just say the number, Sienna. How much money do you want from my father to drop the lawsuit? Name your price right now. Say you want $5 million to make this go away. Say it." She was baiting me. The phrasing was too rigid, too deliberate. She was desperately trying to get me to state a specific financial demand in exchange for dropping a legal claim. In the eyes of the law, demanding a cash payout to drop a probate challenge under the threat of exposing financial ruin could easily be spun as criminal extortion. I looked at her face, flushed with anxious sweat, and then my gaze dropped to her designer handbag resting on my desk. The main flap of the bag was pushed slightly ajar. The office was bathed in bright morning sunlight, but in the dark shadowed interior of her purse I saw it. A tiny rhythmic flash of light. A minuscule blinking red LED. It was a digital audio recorder. Felicity and Diane had not bypassed my security and stormed into my office to beg for their dying father's life. They had come to execute a premeditated trap. They were secretly recording me, trying to goad me into screaming an extortionate demand so they could run straight to the district attorney and have me arrested for corporate blackmail. I let out a long, heavy sigh. If they wanted a performance, I would give them an Oscar-winning one. I slowly sank back into my leather chair, burying my face in my hands for a brief second to mask the predatory smile forming on my lips. I let my shoulders slump forward, projecting the exact image of a defeated, exhausted executive who had finally been pushed to her breaking point. "You win," I whispered, keeping my voice soft and deliberately broken to ensure her little hidden microphone picked up every single syllable. "I am tired, Felicity. I have spent 15 years fighting Richard, and I am just so utterly exhausted by this war." Diane exchanged a triumphant, electrifying look with her daughter. The older woman visibly relaxed, dropping the crumpled lace handkerchief from her face. Felicity puffed out her chest, leaning her weight even heavier against the designer handbag resting on my mahogany desk. She wanted to capture my absolute surrender on tape. She was practically vibrating with the thrill of her impending victory. "So name your price?" Felicity demanded again, her voice ringing with arrogant authority. "Tell us what it will cost to make you drop the probate lawsuit today." I shook my head slowly, looking up at her with manufactured awe. "I do not want a cash payout. I have enough capital to last 10 lifetimes. But before I call my legal team and instruct them to withdraw my claim to the trust, I need you to explain something to me. I need to know for my own sanity." "Explain what?" Diane asked, her tone sharpening with sudden suspicion. She was shrewder than her daughter, sensing a subtle shift in the atmosphere, but she was too intoxicated by my apparent surrender to stop the conversation. "I need to know how you beat me," I said, locking eyes with my half-sister and stroking her massive, fragile ego. "Our grandfather despised Richard. He despised his business practices, his lack of ethics, and his blatant favoritism. He spent his final months ensuring the $50 million trust was locked down tight. When Andre presented that durable power of attorney in court yesterday, my lawyers and I were completely blindsided. How did you manage to outsmart my entire legal division? How did you get a dying man to sign away his entire legacy to a son he actively loathed just 3 days before his death?" Felicity let out a sharp, haughty laugh. She was a textbook narcissist, entirely unable to resist the opportunity to gloat over a vanquished rival. She had spent her entire life being told she was the smartest, most capable woman in the room, and now she believed she had successfully outmaneuvered a Wall Street titan. Diane reached out and placed a warning hand on Felicity's arm, her maternal instincts finally registering the immense danger of the situation. "Felicity, do not!" Diane hissed under her breath. "We have what we came for. Let us just get her formal withdrawal on record and leave." Felicity forcefully brushed her mother's hand away. She did not want to leave. She wanted this victory recorded for posterity. She wanted proof of her absolute brilliance captured on her hidden digital device, ready to be played back for Richard and Andre as a trophy. "He did not sign it willingly, you idiot," Felicity sneered, her voice loud and clear, echoing perfectly across the acoustic paneling of my office. The old man was practically comatose. He was drowning in hospice-grade morphine. He could not even recognize his own private nurses, let alone comprehend a complex legal document granting my father absolute administrative authority over $50 million. "Then how did you get the signature?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly innocent, while internally celebrating the catastrophic legal blunder she was committing. "I took it," Felicity bragged, leaning directly over her handbag to ensure the microphone caught her brilliant confession. I walked into his palliative care room while Diane distracted the medical staff in the hallway. I put the luxury fountain pen in his shaking, bony hand. I wrapped my fingers around his, and I physically forced him to trace the lines on a blank piece of legal paper. But his hand was trembling so violently that the ink smeared. It looked too messy. Diane squeezed her eyes shut, realizing the catastrophic magnitude of her daughter's arrogance. But Felicity was completely unstoppable now. "So, I took the paper home." Felicity continued, a wicked grin spreading across her face. "I put it over a backlit drafting table, and I traced a flawless, steady copy onto the final legal draft myself. It was pathetic how easy it was to replicate his handwriting. Then I paid a cheap, desperate local notary public $5,000 in untraceable cash to stamp it and backdate it by 72 hours. You thought you were the only ruthless woman in this family. Sienna, I outplayed you, your forensic accountants, and your entire team of expensive corporate lawyers." I let her finish. I let the absolute silence hang in the air for 5 full seconds. I let the sheer, unadulterated weight of her felony confession settle into the room. Then I sat up perfectly straight. The manufactured exhaustion vanished from my posture instantly. My spine snapped rigid. The defeated, broken woman they thought they had cornered was entirely gone, replaced by the cold, calculating chief executive officer they had foolishly tried to trap. I reached out across the desk and casually flipped the main flap of her designer handbag entirely open. The dark interior was exposed to the bright morning light, revealing the blinking red LED of the digital audio recorder nestled between her wallet and her keys. Diane shrieked, stumbling backward in her expensive heels as if the handbag had suddenly caught fire. Felicity froze. Her triumphant, arrogant smile decayed into a look of absolute paralyzing horror as I reached into her bag and picked up the small recording device. "You are right about one thing, Felicity," I said, my voice returning to its normal icy authority. "You did record a very compelling piece of evidence today, but you made one fatal miscalculation about engaging in corporate espionage inside a financial institution." I crushed the cheap plastic recorder in my hand. The casing cracked loudly, and I tossed the broken pieces into my steel wastebasket. Felicity let out a strangled gasp, stepping back from the desk, her hands flying to her mouth. "Did you really think a billionaire private equity CEO would hold sensitive, unrecorded meetings in her own office?" I asked, standing up to my full height. "Did you think you were the only one rolling tape?" I pointed a manicured finger toward the discreet dome-shaped glass fixture mounted in the ceiling corner directly above my desk. "Did you know that Wall Street financial firms are required by federal regulations to utilize military-grade audio-enabled security cameras on their executive floors?" I asked softly. "And did you know that those cameras broadcast directly to secure off-site encrypted cloud servers that cannot be deleted?" Felicity's face dropped as the color drained entirely from her skin. She looked up at the camera lens, her breathing turning shallow and erratic. She realized she had just confessed to felony forgery, elder abuse, and bribery on a secure, unalterable corporate server. Felicity stood absolutely paralyzed, her gaze locked on the small glass dome in the ceiling. The realization of what she had just done washed over her like a bucket of ice water. She had walked into the headquarters of a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm and openly bragged about committing multiple federal felonies on a recorded, encrypted server. Diane reacted first. Survival instinct overrode her manufactured elegance. She grabbed her daughter by the forearm, her carefully manicured nails digging into Felicity's expensive silk blouse. "We are leaving," Diane hissed, her voice sharp and brittle with absolute terror. "Right now!" She yanked Felicity toward the heavy oak doors. Felicity stumbled, her designer heels catching on the hardwood floor as her mother essentially dragged her out of my office. They did not look back. They did not try to offer another bribe or throw another insult. They practically ran past my receptionist Gavin, fleeing toward the executive elevators like criminals fleeing a crime scene. I sat back in my leather chair, taking a deep, satisfying breath of the quiet air left in their wake. The trap had snapped shut flawlessly. I pressed the secure intercom button on my desk. "Elias," I said, my voice steady and commanding, "I need you to pull the audio and video feed from my office for the last 10 minutes. Isolate the exact segment where Felicity Carmichael confesses to forcing a dying man to trace a signature, forging a legal document, and bribing a notary public. Clean the audio track, compress the file, and send it directly to my secure mobile device." "Already isolating the timestamps, boss," Elias replied through the speaker, the rapid clacking of his keyboard echoing his efficiency. "The confession is crystal clear. Sending the encrypted file to your device now." My phone buzzed on the mahogany desk. I picked it up, unlocking the screen to find the compressed audio file waiting for me. It was a digital bullet primed and ready to fire. I opened my messaging application and pulled up my father's contact profile. I did not type a long, drawn-out paragraph. I did not hurl insults or make explicit threats. I simply attached the audio file containing his favored daughter's felony confession. Beneath the attachment, I typed a single universal symbol of impending doom. A ticking clock emoji. I pressed send. I did not need to be physically present at the sprawling Carmichael estate in the Hamptons to know exactly how the fallout unfolded. I had the next best thing. I had Andre Washington. My newly turned insider was sitting right in the middle of the blast zone, providing me with real-time encrypted text updates regarding every agonizing minute of my father's downfall. According to Andre's reports, Richard was sitting in his lavish home office when my text message arrived. He played the audio file on speakerphone. Andre was standing right across the desk, handing over revised bankruptcy projections, when Felicity's voice suddenly echoed through the room. Andre described watching the color drain completely from Richard's face. My father listened to his golden child cheerfully detail how she committed elder abuse, forged a document holding the key to a $50 million trust, and paid a $5,000 bribe to a crooked notary. Richard knew instantly that the recording was not just a threat to his probate court case. It was a direct, undeniable ticket to a federal penitentiary for his entire family. Seconds after the audio finished playing, the front doors of the estate slammed open. Diane and Felicity sprinted into the house, screaming in absolute hysterics. Andre texted me that Felicity collapsed onto one of the expensive living room sofas, sobbing uncontrollably, while Diane rushed into the home office to find her husband. "She recorded us, Richard!" Diane had shrieked, pacing the length of the Persian rug. "Sienna had hidden security cameras. She has Felicity on tape admitting to the forgery. She is going to send it to the district attorney. We are going to lose everything." Richard did not yell at them. He did not throw things or berate his daughter for her catastrophic stupidity. According to Andre, Richard went completely, terrifyingly silent. The gravity of the situation was too immense for a tantrum. The forged power of attorney was the only shield keeping his creditors at bay. Without it, he could not access my grandfather's trust to pay off the $30 million he owed my firm. And now the very existence of that forged document was a federal crime captured on a Wall Street security server. If I handed that audio file over to Judge Warren and the FBI, Richard would be indicted for conspiracy to commit fraud. Diane would be charged as an accessory. Felicity would face decades behind bars for elder abuse and forgery. And because Richard had used Felicity's social security number to take out massive shadow loans, her impending arrest would trigger immediate default clauses from predatory private lenders. The entire Carmichael family was entirely surrounded. The walls were closing in, and the room was rapidly running out of oxygen. He is pacing the floor. Andre texted me his messages arriving in rapid bursts. He is sweating through his shirt. Diane is hyperventilating in the corner. He knows he cannot win in court anymore. The audio file destroys his entire legal strategy. He is panicking. I watched the messages roll in, sipping a fresh espresso. I typed back a simple command to my mole. Keep observing. Tell me exactly what his next move is. I waited for 10 minutes. The silence in my office stood in stark contrast to the absolute chaos erupting miles away. My father was a cornered animal, and cornered animals always make desperate, fatal decisions. My phone vibrated violently against the desk. Another update from Andre. He just locked the office doors, Andre wrote. He told Diane to go pack her most expensive jewelry and any untraceable cash she has in the household safe. He is bypassing the corporate legal team entirely. I sat forward, my eyes locked on the glowing screen. He just made a call on a burner phone. Andre's next message read, "He is calling an emergency off the books meeting for midnight tonight. He says the legal route is dead. If he cannot win in court, he is going to liquidate the entire company, drain whatever liquid assets are left in the accounts, and sell the whole portfolio to a private buyer." I smiled, a cold, predatory satisfaction washing over me. The final message from Andre confirmed my absolute victory. He is planning a fire sale, Sienna. He wants to take the cash and flee the country before you can file the injunction. He is planning a fire sale, Sienna. He wants to take the cash and flee the country before you can file the injunction. I read the text message twice, letting the sheer desperation of my father's plan wash over me. The digital glow of my phone reflected in the darkened glass of my penthouse window, contrasting with the brilliant city lights stretching out below. A fire sale of this magnitude was financial suicide under normal circumstances. To liquidate an entire corporate portfolio, along with a heavily contested $50 million trust, required months of rigorous due diligence, board approvals, and exhaustive federal filings. But Richard was no longer operating in the legitimate market. He was a cornered animal, and he was diving straight into the subterranean financial underworld to save his own skin. My phone vibrated with another rapid burst of encrypted messages from Andre. Standing in the darkened hallway of the Hamptons estate, my newly turned insider was giving me a flawless play-by-play of Richard's descent into madness. My father had locked himself inside his soundproofed home office. He bypassed the corporate network, entirely booting up an untraceable encrypted laptop he kept hidden behind a false bookshelf. He was utilizing fixers on the dark web, international brokers who specialized in moving massive toxic assets for executives desperate to vanish without a trace. The updates from my mole painted a picture of absolute terrifying chaos. Richard was shopping his entire legacy for pennies on the dollar. He needed a buyer with limitless liquidity and zero ethical boundaries, someone who would not ask questions about forged probate documents or pending defamation lawsuits. Within 2 hours of sending out his distress signal into the digital void, Richard found his savior. Andre texted me the details, his messages laden with escalating panic. A representative for a mysterious Russian billionaire had answered the call. The oligarch was looking to immediately park a massive amount of dirty money in American commercial real estate to evade impending international banking sanctions. The Russian buyer did not care about the toxic mortgages my firm now held. He did not care about the raging legal war over my grandfather's estate. He only cared about laundering his capital quickly through brick-and-mortar assets on U.S. soil. The Russian made a brutal take-it-or-leave-it offer. $40 million in clean, untraceable offshore cash. In exchange, Richard had to surrender total ownership of the Carmichael Real Estate Group and sign over all administrative rights to my grandfather's $50 million trust. The catch was the timeline. The oligarch demanded a 24-hour closing window. There would be no standard appraisals, no lengthy escrow periods, and no protective legal contingencies. It was a blind midnight transfer of power for a mountain of ghost capital. To a man staring down the barrel of a federal prison sentence and a $30 million debt to his own estranged daughter, $40 million in an offshore account was an absolute miracle. But executing a phantom transaction of that size required a flawless exit strategy. Richard could not simply wire the money to the Cayman Islands and vanish without leaving someone behind to absorb the catastrophic blast radius. The federal government would demand blood for the sudden illegal liquidation of a contested estate. Richard needed scapegoats. Andre managed to record a fraction of Richard's phone conversation with the offshore broker by pressing his phone against the bottom gap of the heavy office door. He sent the audio file directly to my secure server. I put my earpiece in and listened to my father orchestrate the ultimate betrayal of his own family. My father was confirming the flight logistics for a private charter plane departing from a secluded, unregulated airstrip in New Jersey. He was booking a single one-way ticket under an assumed name. The broker on the other end of the line asked a very pointed question about the impending federal investigations regarding the forged power of attorney and the massive shadow loans. Richard let out a cold, soulless laugh. It was a sound completely devoid of human empathy, the sound of a narcissist who believed he had finally outsmarted everyone. He told the broker not to worry about the federal authorities. He explained his exit strategy with chilling precision. He reminded the broker that his golden child Felicity had her signature forged on every single piece of toxic shadow debt. When the private equity lenders came to collect their $20 million, they would bypass the empty shell of his company and seize everything Felicity owned. She would be financially annihilated the moment his plane left American airspace. As for the forged probate document, Richard had an even darker plan. He told the broker he was leaving behind a fabricated paper trail indicating that his chief financial officer, Andre Washington, had masterminded the entire forgery scheme to steal the trust for his wife. Richard was going to take the $40 million fly to a non-extradition country and leave his favorite daughter and his fiercely loyal son-in-law to face the FBI, the IRS, and decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The recording ended. I sat in the quiet authority of my Wall Street office, feeling a surge of predatory satisfaction. Richard Carmichael possessed zero loyalty to anyone but his own survival. He was perfectly willing to feed his own family to the wolves to escape the trap I had built for him. Miles away, the reality of that betrayal was tearing Andre apart. The arrogant executive who had tried to bribe me with $1 million just hours ago was now realizing that his father-in-law was preparing to sacrifice him to the federal government without a second thought. Andre was looking down the barrel of a ruined life entirely orchestrated by the man he had committed fraud to protect. My secure line suddenly lit up. It was not a text message this time. It was a direct incoming voice call from my inside mole. I pressed the button to accept the connection, leaning back in my leather chair. Andre was hyperventilating on the other end of the line. I could hear the muffled echoing sound of his panicked breathing. He had locked himself inside one of the estate's marble guest bathrooms, whispering frantically into the receiver so his wife and mother-in-law would not hear his utter despair. Sienna, Andre gasped, his voice trembling with sheer, unadulterated terror. "He is selling us out. I heard everything. He is taking the money and leaving us to take the fall for the forgery and the debt." I kept my voice perfectly level, letting him spin out in his own panic. "What is the timeline, Andre?" "He scheduled a secret midnight signing tomorrow at the corporate headquarters," Andre whispered rapidly, his breath hitching in his throat. "The Russian representative is flying in to execute the transfer in person. Richard is liquidating everything and running. You have to stop him, Sienna. You have to stop this sale before he destroys us all. You have to stop him, Sienna. You have to stop this sale before he destroys us all." I let Andre's terrified voice echo in the silent glass-enclosed space of my office. He was weeping, a broken corporate executive hiding in a marble bathroom begging for salvation. He expected me to call the authorities. He expected me to dispatch the federal agents we had discussed and raid the Hamptons estate before my father could sign the corporate death warrant. I am not going to stop him, Andre, I said, my voice as calm and steady as a surgeon's scalpel. I want you to do exactly the opposite. You are going to help him pack his bags. You are going to ensure he has every single legal document prepared for that midnight signing. You are going to walk him directly to the slaughterhouse. What are you talking about? Andre gasped, his breath hitching. If he signs that paperwork, the company is gone. The trust is gone. Felicity and I will be left holding $20 million in shadow debt. We will be arrested. You will only be arrested if the buyer decides to press charges for the fraudulent debts, I replied smoothly. And I can personally guarantee that the buyer will be far more interested in corporate restructuring than sending you to prison provided you follow my exact instructions. Keep your mouth shut, smile at your father-in-law, and make sure he signs the absolute surrender of his empire. I terminated the call before Andre could ask another panicked question. I tossed my secure phone onto the mahogany desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city was quiet, hovering in that dead hour before the dawn, but my mind was operating at terminal velocity. Calling the police right now was the worst possible strategic move. If the FBI raided the Carmichael estate, my grandfather's $50 million trust would instantly become evidence in a sprawling multi-year federal racketeering investigation. The assets would be frozen by the government. The probate court would tie up the capital in endless litigation, draining the accounts through administrative fees and bureaucratic red tape. I would be fighting the Department of Justice just to claim what was rightfully mine. I did not want a messy public legal war. I wanted total, undisputed ownership, and my father had just handed me the perfect mechanism to acquire it. By rushing to sell the entire Carmichael real estate group and the associated trust assets to a dark web buyer, Richard was willingly bypassing the probate court. He was bypassing the standard legal protections. He was preparing to sign a binding, irrevocable transfer of absolute ownership in exchange for offshore cash. He thought he was laundering money for a Russian oligarch. He thought he was escaping justice. He was actually digging his own grave. I walked back to my desk and pressed the intercom button. Gavin, wake up Pierce and Elias. Tell them to get back into the boardroom immediately. The strategy has completely changed. 10 minutes later, my lead corporate attorney and my top forensic analyst were standing in front of my desk. They looked exhausted, running on caffeine and adrenaline, but their eyes sharpened the moment I outlined the new objective. We are not calling the authorities yet, I announced, pacing the length of the Persian rug. Richard has arranged a fire sale. He is selling the entire company and surrendering the trust to a Russian billionaire tomorrow at midnight for $40 million in untraceable cash. Pierce frowned, adjusting his glasses. We have to file an emergency injunction, Sienna. If he moves that money offshore, retrieving it will be a nightmare. We are not filing an injunction, I stated, turning to face them with a cold, predatory smile. We are going to buy the company. Elias blinked, his fingers twitching as he processed the magnitude of the pivot. You want to hijack a dark web transaction. I want to become the transaction, I corrected him. Richard is deliberately avoiding due diligence because he thinks he is dealing with a criminal organization. He is not going to check the ultimate beneficial owner of the purchasing entity because the entire premise of the deal is total anonymity. He wants ghost capital. We are going to give it to him. I turned to Pierce. I need you to build a corporate shell. I want it registered in Cyprus, routed through the Cayman Islands, and entirely insulated behind 3 layers of blind trusts. I want it to look exactly like a sophisticated money laundering vehicle for Eastern European oligarchs. Can you do it by tomorrow afternoon? Pierce grinned, a dangerous, thrilling light sparking in his eyes. I can have the shell company incorporated and heavily armored by breakfast. It will be completely impenetrable. Richard's brokers will run their background checks and find nothing but a solid brick wall of offshore banking secrecy. It is exactly what he is looking for. Good, I said, shifting my gaze to my forensic analyst. Elias, I need you to liquidize $40 million from our aggressive acquisition fund. Route it through our international holding accounts. Break it into staggered wire transfers so it mimics the chaotic financial flow of illicit capital. I want the money sitting in a holding account fully verified and ready for immediate deployment by tomorrow night. 40 million is pocket change for our acquisition fund. Boss, Elias replied, already pulling out his encrypted tablet to begin writing the transfer algorithms. I will have the capital washed and staged in a secure offshore account before your morning coffee. We need a proxy, I continued, finalizing the trap. Richard is expecting a representative of the Russian billionaire to attend the midnight signing in person. We need someone who looks the part, someone cold, ruthless, and entirely unflappable. Pierce nodded immediately. I know exactly who to call. We have a specialized corporate contractor we use for hostile blind acquisitions. He is a former intelligence officer who operates as a legal proxy for our most sensitive international buyouts. He speaks fluent Russian, wears bespoke suits, and has eyes like dead fish. Richard will be absolutely terrified of him. He will not ask a single question before signing the paperwork. Call him, I commanded. Brief him on the parameters of the deal. Tell him he is not negotiating. He is simply verifying the signatures and executing the final transfer of ownership. The rest of the night blurred into a masterclass of high-speed corporate warfare. I sat at the head of the boardroom table, orchestrating the creation of a phantom empire. We built the Cypress Shell Corporation from the ground up, outfitting it with fake executive boards, dummy websites, and heavily padded financial histories that would pass any superficial dark web vetting process. We weaponized the very secrecy Richard was relying on to destroy him. By the time the sun fully breached the horizon, painting the Wall Street skyscrapers in brilliant shades of gold and amber, the trap was fully armed. I sat alone in my office, watching the massive digital monitors mounted on the wall. The screens displayed the live encrypted feed of our newly created offshore holding accounts. I watched with deep, profound satisfaction as the final wire transfers aligned perfectly. The numbers ticked upward, locking into place. $40 million in liquid deployable capital sat waiting in the dark. My secure phone buzzed on the desk. It was an encrypted message from Pierce. The proxy is briefed and confirmed, the message read. He will attend the signing in person at the Carmichael headquarters tomorrow night at exactly midnight. The bait is set. I locked the screen of my phone and leaned back in my chair, staring out at the waking city. My father thought he was executing a brilliant escape. He thought he was selling his toxic empire to a ruthless foreign criminal to evade justice and rob his own daughter. He had no idea that he was walking directly into a corporate slaughterhouse, and he was bringing the knife with him. The clock on the wall of the Carmichael Real Estate Group boardroom struck midnight. The top floor of the corporate headquarters was entirely empty, save for the 6 people gathered around the massive mahogany table. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, blurring the lights of the Manhattan skyline. Inside the room, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense, charged with a mixture of raw greed and paralyzing fear. Richard sat at the head of the table. He was leaning forward, his eyes locked with absolute predatory hunger on the thick stack of legal documents resting on the polished wood. To his right sat Diane, her hands tightly gripping a fresh designer handbag, her knuckles white. Felicity sat beside her mother, bouncing her knee rapidly under the table. The spoiled heiress was entirely unaware that the man she called her father was about to board a private jet and leave her stranded with $20 million in fraudulent high-interest shadow debt. Across from the Carmichael family sat my proxy. The former intelligence officer was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. He wore a bespoke charcoal gray suit that looked as sharp as a razor blade. His posture was rigid, his facial expression completely devoid of any recognizable human emotion. He had introduced himself only as Nikolai, a legal representative for a Moscow-based holdings consortium. He spoke with a faint, chillingly precise Eastern European accent, demanding absolute compliance and refusing to answer a single question regarding the identity of his billionaire employer. Sitting at the far end of the table was Andre Washington. The chief financial officer was sweating profusely. A steady bead of perspiration rolled down his dark temple, soaking into the collar of his expensive dress shirt. Andre knew exactly what was happening. He knew the Russian oligarch did not exist. He knew that the $40 million currently parked in a digital escrow account belonged to my private equity firm. But Andre also knew that if he uttered a single word of warning to his father-in-law, I would send the evidence of his $5 million Las Vegas embezzlement directly to the FBI. So Andre sat in terrified silence, playing his role as the obedient executive while actively marching his family into a financial slaughterhouse. These are the final transfer agreements. Nikolai stated, his voice a low mechanical rumble. He slid a heavy silver pen across the table toward my father. They execute an immediate, irrevocable transfer of all corporate assets, intellectual property, and real estate holdings currently registered under the Carmichael Real Estate Group. Furthermore, they sign over total administrative rights and beneficiary control of the $50 million trust established by Josiah Carmichael. By signing these documents, you forfeit all rights to future litigation, arbitration, or appeal. The sale is absolute. Richard picked up the silver pen. He did not look at the staggering list of legal concessions. He only cared about the money. "And the capital?" Richard asked, his voice rough with greedy anticipation. "The $40 million is staged." Nikolai reached into his jacket and pulled out an encrypted tablet. He placed it on the table and tapped the screen. A digital banking ledger appeared, displaying a confirmed, verified balance of $40 million, sitting in an offshore holding account, ready for immediate deployment. "The capital is clean-washed and verified," Nikolai confirmed coldly. "The moment my signature joins yours on the final page, the escrow lock releases. The funds will wire directly into the Cayman Islands routing number you provided. You will have total liquidity before your flight leaves the tarmac tonight." A sickening, triumphant smile spread across Richard's face. He looked at Diane, who let out a shaky breath of relief. He looked at Felicity, who smiled back, utterly oblivious to her impending financial annihilation. He completely ignored Andre. "This is how you handle a rebellious, ungrateful child," Richard gloated, uncapping the silver pen. "Sienna thought she could walk into a probate court and hold me hostage. She thought a few Wall Street tricks could dismantle my legacy. She spent 15 years building her little firm, and I am neutralizing her entirely in a single night. By the time the sun comes up, her lawyers will be fighting over an empty corporate shell. The trust is gone. The assets are gone. I beat her." Andre stared at his hands, looking physically ill. Richard lowered the pen to the heavy parchment. The quiet scratching of ink against paper was the only sound in the boardroom. He signed the corporate dissolution forms. He signed the immediate transfer of the mezzanine debt. He signed away my grandfather's $50 million trust. Page after page, Richard gleefully surrendered every single piece of leverage he possessed in the world, believing he was outsmarting the United States legal system and securing his offshore fortune. He flipped to the final page, the master agreement that bound all the previous contracts into an unbreakable, unappealable corporate surrender. He signed his name with a violent, arrogant flourish. Richard slid the heavy leather folio back across the mahogany table. "It is done," my father announced, leaning back in his chair with the profound satisfaction of a man who believed he had just committed the perfect crime. "Execute the wire transfer." Nikolai did not smile. He did not offer a congratulatory handshake. He simply picked up the silver pen, turned to the final page, and carefully inspected Richard's signatures to ensure they were legally binding. Satisfied, the proxy lowered the pen and applied his own signature to the countersign line. He closed the leather folio with a heavy, definitive thud. "The transfer of ownership is legally binding and complete," Nikolai stated, his voice completely hollow. He picked up his encrypted tablet and pressed a single button. "The holding account has been authorized for release." Richard let out a loud, booming laugh, slamming his hand down on the table in victory. Diane clapped her hands together, tears of relief shining in her eyes. Felicity leaned back, crossing her arms with a smug, victorious sneer. They had won. They had stolen my grandfather's money, liquidated the family empire, and secured their escape. Then the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom swung violently open. The heavy brass handles slammed against the interior walls with a deafening crash that echoed like a gunshot. The laughter died instantly in my father's throat. Diane shrieked, jumping in her seat. Felicity spun around in her chair, her smug expression evaporating into a mask of pure shock. I walked into the boardroom, my posture impeccably straight, my expression an impenetrable mask of cold authority. The heavy doors settled shut behind me with a soft, definitive click, sealing us all inside the executive suite. For a split second, sheer panic flickered in my father's eyes. He had assumed I was fast asleep in my penthouse, completely ignorant of his midnight fire sale. But that initial panic quickly dissolved into a booming, triumphant laugh that echoed sharply off the glass walls. He stood up from the head of the mahogany table, adjusting his expensive silk tie, thoroughly convinced he had won the ultimate victory. "You are too late, Sienna," Richard declared, his voice dripping with intense condescension and arrogant glee. "Did you really think I would just sit back and let a petulant, ungrateful child strip me of my legacy? I told you at the courthouse that I only needed 30 days to destroy you? I did it in less than 2. Diane let out a sharp, mocking laugh, quickly recovering from her initial shock at my arrival. She crossed her arms, pulling her designer wrap tightly around her shoulders, looking at me with pure, unadulterated disdain. "You should have taken whatever settlement Andre offered you at the country club. We were being generous. Now you get to walk away with exactly what you deserve. Nothing." Felicity leaned forward in her plush leather chair, her eyes sparkling with malicious, spoiled joy. She practically vibrated with the thrill of thinking she had finally beaten me. "The money is gone, Sienna," she sneered, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the signed leather folio resting in the center of the table. "We sold it all. The real estate group, the toxic debt you thought gave you leverage, and that precious $50 million trust you were so desperate to steal from us. Every single asset has been liquidated. You are left with absolutely nothing." I did not yell. I did not demand to see the contracts. I did not display a single ounce of the frantic devastation they were all so eagerly anticipating. Instead, I let a profound, suffocating silence descend upon the boardroom. The sound of the relentless rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows was the only noise filling the heavy air. I walked slowly toward the center of the room, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. Every step was deliberate, measured, and entirely devoid of urgency. I was a predator taking my time before the final strike. Andre Washington shrank back into his chair as I passed him, his eyes completely hollow and terrified. He knew the guillotine was about to drop, and he was powerless to stop it. I reached the side of the massive mahogany table where a silver ice bucket sat, chilling a bottle of vintage champagne my father had clearly ordered to celebrate his successful escape from federal justice. I picked up a crystal flute, uncorked the bottle with a soft hiss, and poured myself a generous measure. The golden liquid bubbled and popped in the quiet room. My father watched me, his triumphant smile beginning to waver at the edges. My complete lack of outrage was visibly unnerving him. A cornered, defeated woman was supposed to scream and threaten desperate lawsuits. She was not supposed to calmly pour herself a drink. I raised the crystal flute to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The champagne was crisp and dry, a perfect complement to the absolute destruction I was about to unleash. I let the taste settle on my tongue, savoring the exact moment 15 years of exile and struggle culminated in total domination. "It is a beautiful vintage, Richard," I said softly, lowering the glass and looking him dead in the eye. "A very fitting choice to celebrate the absolute conclusion of your career." Richard scoffed, slamming his hand flat against the table in a sudden burst of defensive anger. "My career is just fine. I am retiring to a private island with $40 million in untraceable offshore cash, while you are left holding a bankrupt corporate shell. You lost Sienna. Accept it and get out of my building." I took another leisurely sip of the champagne, letting his delusion peak before I shattered it completely. I turned my gaze away from my father and looked directly at the stony-faced proxy sitting perfectly still across the table. Nikolai had not moved a single muscle since I entered the room. His hands were resting neatly on top of his encrypted tablet, his posture impeccably rigid. Diane and Felicity followed my gaze, their brows furrowing in sudden creeping confusion. Why was I ignoring their victory laps to stare at the Russian billionaire's legal representative? "Tell me, Nikolai," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the expansive boardroom. "How did the transaction proceed? Were there any complications with the transfer of ownership?" The suffocating tension in the room snapped like a frayed wire. Richard let out a loud, confused bark of laughter, looking wildly from me to the proxy. Why are you talking to him? He works for a Moscow consortium. He does not answer to a failed Wall Street startup CEO. Nikolai ignored my father entirely. The intimidating, icy demeanor of the Eastern European proxy melted away in a single fluid instant. He stood up from his leather executive chair, reached up to straighten his bespoke charcoal tie, and offered me a sharp, deeply respectful nod. The thick, chilling Russian accent he had maintained all evening vanished completely, replaced by the crisp, professional tone of an American corporate operative. No complications at all, Nikolai stated, pushing the signed, irrevocable leather folio across the polished mahogany table directly toward me. All paperwork executed perfectly, boss. The silence that followed Nikolai's declaration was absolute, a heavy, suffocating vacuum that sucked the oxygen straight out of the room. Richard stared at the man he thought was a shadowy Russian emissary, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled onto dry land. His brain was violently rejecting the reality unfolding right in front of him. Diane's grip on her designer handbag slackened, the expensive leather slipping from her trembling fingers to hit the floor with a dull thud. Felicity darted her eyes between Nikolai and me, her face contorting into a mask of aggressive confusion. "What is he talking about?" Felicity demanded, her voice shrill and piercing. "Richard, tell him to wire the money. Stop looking at her." My father could not speak. He was paralyzed, staring at the heavy leather folio resting under my manicured hand. I pulled the master agreement toward me and flipped it open. The ink from Richard's signature was still fresh, catching the dim light of the boardroom. "Allow me to translate," I said, my voice echoing with lethal precision across the mahogany table. "There is no Moscow Holdings Consortium. There is no desperate foreign billionaire trying to launder cash through American real estate to evade international banking sanctions. The Cypress Shell Corporation you so eagerly vetted on the dark web was incorporated yesterday morning by my lead corporate attorney. The routing numbers in the Cayman Islands belong to a heavily insulated blind trust." I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the faces of my defeated family. "The entire entity is a wholly owned subsidiary of Carmichael and Black," I stated. Richard's chest heaved. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning a stark bone white. "No," he rasped, his voice barely a terrified whisper. "The capital, the $40 million. I saw the digital escrow. It was verified." "Oh, the capital is entirely real," I confirmed, offering him a razor-thin, predatory smile. "It is fully washed liquid and verified. But it is not dirty offshore money, Richard. It is the aggressive acquisition fund from my private equity firm. The money you tried to steal from my grandfather's trust pales in comparison to the corporate war chest I command on Wall Street." I tapped my finger against his final signature on the master agreement. "You didn't sell the company to a Russian dad." I delivered the killing blow, the words dropping like heavy anvils in the quiet room. "You legally sold it to me." The blood drained from Richard's face so rapidly, I thought he might actually suffer the cardiac event Diane had fabricated in my office earlier that morning. He lunged forward with a sudden, desperate burst of energy, his hands scrambling across the polished wood, trying to snatch the leather folio back. Nikolai moved with the speed of a striking snake. The former intelligence officer clamped a vice-like grip onto Richard's wrist, pinning his arm flat against the table. Richard gasped in pain, his panicked struggle instantly neutralized. I simply pulled the folio safely out of his reach. "Read the fine print, Richard," I advised, coldly closing the heavy cover. "In your absolute desperation to liquidate this empire and flee the country with ghost capital, you agreed to the buyer's terms without a single legal contingency. You signed a binding, irrevocable transfer of absolute ownership. But more importantly, to expedite the cash transfer and bypass the probate court entirely, you eagerly signed the waiver of indemnification." My father stopped struggling against Nikolai's grip. He stared at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. He had spent decades in real estate. He knew exactly what that clause meant in the corporate finance world. "And by signing that waiver to expedite the sale, you surrendered all rights to appeal," I explained, driving the final nail into his coffin. You surrendered the right to contest the sale. You surrendered the right to arbitrate. You voluntarily handed over total control of the Carmichael Real Estate Group, the toxic mezzanine debt, and my grandfather's $50 million trust directly to me. It is an ironclad, legally impenetrable surrender. I own every single brick, every single bank account, and every single asset that carries our family name. The absolute magnitude of his catastrophic failure finally registered. A guttural, agonizing sound tore itself from Richard's throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated defeat. He slumped back into his executive chair, a broken, bankrupt man who had just handed the keys to his entire kingdom to the daughter he had thrown out onto the street 15 years ago. A piercing, ear-splitting scream shattered the silence. Diane had leaped to her feet, her chair crashing backward onto the floor. She pointed a trembling hand at my face, her carefully constructed elegance replaced by raw, frantic terror. "You cannot do this!" Diane shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "We are ruined! We have nothing left! You stole everything from us!" "I took back what was mine," I corrected her, my tone utterly devoid of sympathy. "You brought this entirely on yourselves." Felicity sprang up next to her mother. Her face was flushed with panicked rage. She looked at the sealed leather folio, then at my father's broken posture, and finally, the horrific reality of her own situation dawned on her. Without her father's empire, her lavish lifestyle, her credit cards, and her unearned social status were completely dead. She was facing total financial annihilation. "Andre!" Felicity screamed, whirling around to face her husband. "Do something! Call the lawyers! Stop the wire transfer! Fix this right now!" Andre Washington did not reach for his phone. The chief financial officer of the now defunct Carmichael Empire stood up slowly from the far end of the boardroom table. His tailored suit looked as though it hung on a ghost. He looked at his hysterical wife, then he looked at me. He remembered the photographs of the underground Las Vegas casinos. He remembered the unedited ledgers he had handed over to my forensic analysts. He knew with absolute terrifying certainty that any attempt to fight me would result in his immediate arrest for embezzling $5 million. And worse, he knew what was about to come through those doors. "Andre!" Felicity shrieked again, taking a step toward him. "Why are you just standing there? She is stealing our money. Do your job." Andre did not say a single word. He raised his hands in a gesture of complete surrender and began backing away slowly toward the heavy mahogany doors. He was abandoning the sinking ship, actively retreating from the toxic fallout of the Carmichael family to save his own skin before the blast radius consumed him. "Where are you going?" Felicity demanded, her voice dissolving into a panicked, high-pitched wail as she watched her husband retreat. "You cannot leave us here." Andre kept backing away, his eyes locked firmly on the floor, refusing to meet his wife's desperate gaze. I turned away from the pathetic spectacle of my family turning on each other. I pulled back the sleeve of my charcoal blazer and looked down at my sleek, minimalist wristwatch. The second hand ticked precisely into place. "Right on time," I said softly. The faint, distant wail of sirens began to bleed through the soundproof glass of the boardroom windows. At first, it was just a low hum blending with the driving rain, but within seconds, the noise multiplied. The shrieks of multiple police cruisers and unmarked federal vehicles echoed off the surrounding Manhattan skyscrapers, converging directly on the street level of the Carmichael building. Richard's head snapped toward the windows. The triumphant glow of his offshore escape had already vanished, but now pure primal panic set in. He looked at the heavy mahogany doors, then at me, his chest heaving as he finally understood the true scope of my trap. I had not just come to take his company. I had come to take his freedom. A sharp melodic chime echoed through the reception area outside. The private executive elevators, which Richard had explicitly locked down for his midnight fire sale, were opening. The heavy boardroom doors were shoved open so violently they struck the drywall with a thunderous crack. A dozen men and women wearing tactical vests, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, flooded into the room. They moved with absolute terrifying efficiency, fanning out to secure every exit and surround the mahogany table. Federal agents! The lead investigator barked, his voice carrying the hardened authority of a man who took down Wall Street criminals for a living. Nobody moves. Keep your hands where I can see them. Diane let out a piercing shriek and dropped to her knees, burying her face in her hands. Richard stood frozen, his hands raised in the air, his eyes wide with absolute horror. Felicity pressed her back against the glass wall, trembling violently, as two armed agents flanked her. The lead agent, a tall man with steel-gray hair named Agent Vance, stepped forward. He did not look at my father. He walked straight to the head of the table where I was standing. "Miss Carmichael," Agent Vance said, offering a curt professional nod. "I assume you have the deliverables." "Everything is verified and ready for federal processing, Agent Vance," I replied smoothly. I reached into the breast pocket of my blazer and pulled out a sleek encrypted flash drive. I held it up so my father could see exactly what was about to destroy his life. On this drive, I stated clearly, ensuring my family heard every single word. "You will find the real, unedited accounting ledgers of the Carmichael Real Estate Group, confirming years of systematic tax evasion and corporate embezzlement. You will find irrefutable proof of $20 million in unregulated shadow loans obtained through felony identity theft. And as promised, you will find a high-definition audio-visual recording of Felicity Carmichael explicitly confessing to elder abuse, bribing a notary public, and forging a legal probate document." I placed the flash drive directly into Agent Vance's gloved hand. "That is a lie," Felicity screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "She is setting us up. Daddy, tell them she is lying." Agent Vance ignored her outburst. He signaled to his team. "Richard Carmichael, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, tax evasion, and aggravated identity theft. Felicity Carmichael, you are under arrest for felony forgery and elder abuse." An agent stepped toward Felicity with a pair of steel handcuffs. She backed away, shaking her head frantically. "No, you cannot arrest me. I am the victim here. He is the one who took out all those loans. Sienna just said it." "Yes, Felicity," I interjected, my voice dripping with cold, calculated pity. "He did take out those loans. He took out $20 million in predatory high-interest debt from underground lenders. But he did not use his own name. He used yours. He used your social security number to secure the capital because his own credit was completely radioactive." Felicity stopped struggling against the agent. Her eyes darted toward Richard, her jaw dropping as the absolute horror of her financial reality finally crashed down on her. "He spent 5 years grooming your financial profile," I explained, watching the golden child realize she was nothing but a sacrificial lamb. "He bought you cars and designer clothes to build your credit entirely so he could weaponize it when his empire failed. You do not just face prison for forgery, Felicity. You are personally, legally on the hook for $20 million. When those shadow lenders come to collect, they will seize every single thing you own. He bankrupted you to save himself." "You did what—" Felicity shrieked, her voice tearing at the seams. She lunged toward Richard, her hands curled into claws. "You ruined my life. I did everything you asked. I forged that document for you. I broke the law for you. And you put $20 million of debt in my name. I was trying to save the family." Richard bellowed back, his own panic giving way to defensive rage. "I gave you a life of luxury. You owe me." "I owe you prison!" Felicity screamed, thrashing against the agents who were now forcibly restraining her. She spat venomous curses at the man she had idolized her entire life. The beautiful, cohesive facade of the Carmichael family dissolved into a vicious, ugly screaming match. They were turning on each other like starved animals in a cage. While the agents worked to subdue the screaming father and daughter, Andre Washington realized his own precarious position. The CFO had handed over the ledgers to secure an immunity deal, but the sight of the federal raid sent his flight instinct into overdrive. He knew the FBI would still need to detain him for questioning, and the sheer terror of facing federal custody broke his mind. Andre spun around and bolted. He sprinted away from the mahogany table, heading straight for the heavy steel door that led to the emergency stairwell. "Suspect running," an agent yelled. Andre did not make it 3 steps. A massive federal agent lunged forward, launching his entire body weight into the fleeing CFO. The agent tackled Andre around the waist, driving him violently into the polished hardwood floor. The impact echoed with a sickening thud. Andre groaned in pain as the agent swiftly pinned his arms behind his back, pressing a knee between his shoulder blades. "Do not move," the agent barked, hauling Andre up by the collar and slapping handcuffs onto his wrists. The boardroom was a portrait of absolute devastation. Diane was weeping uncontrollably on the floor, surrounded by discarded designer bags and shattered illusions. Andre was pressed against the wall in steel cuffs, breathing heavily. Felicity was sobbing, her makeup smeared across her face, as an agent read her Miranda rights. I stood perfectly still, watching the execution of justice unfold exactly as I had orchestrated. Agent Vance stepped behind my father. He grabbed Richard's arms and wrenched them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around Richard's wrists echoed above the chaos of the room. Richard turned his head, his eyes burning with a mixture of absolute hatred and defeated terror. He looked at me, realizing that the daughter he had discarded had just orchestrated his complete and total destruction. Richard opened his mouth to hurl one last desperate curse, but Agent Vance gave him no opportunity. The lead investigator gripped my father by the bicep and shoved him forward toward the exit. The heavy, shuffling footsteps of the federal agents filled the room as they began hauling my family away. Diane was practically carried out by two officers, her knees buckling as she wailed uncontrollably, mourning the death of her socialite status more than her actual freedom. Felicity was still screaming, her voice growing hoarse as she shrieked empty, delusional threats about suing the federal government and ruining my life. Her protests faded as she was dragged into the corridor, joining the defeated, shuffling figure of her husband. The elevator chimed in the reception area. The doors slid open, swallowed the remnants of the Carmichael dynasty, and closed. Then there was only silence. The suffocating chaos of the last hour vanished, leaving behind a profound, crystalline stillness. I stood alone at the head of the massive mahogany table. The leather folio containing the absolute surrender of my father's empire sat exactly where he had left it, the ink of his signature completely dry. Beside it rested the silver pen he had used to sign his own corporate death warrant. I picked the pen up, rolling the cool, expensive metal between my fingers for a fraction of a second before dropping it into the metal wastebasket nearby. I had no use for his tools. I walked slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The violent rainstorm that had battered the glass all evening was finally breaking, giving way to the cold, sharp clarity of the early morning hours. The brilliant lights of the Manhattan skyline stretched out endlessly beneath me. Millions of people were asleep in those high rises, completely unaware that a corporate empire had just been dismantled and conquered in the span of a single night. People often assume that revenge brings a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion. They expect tearful forgiveness, a lingering sense of guilt, or a hollow sadness over the destruction of one's own blood. I felt absolutely none of those things. Looking down at the city I had conquered, I searched myself for a shred of grief. I found nothing but cold, hard justice. My father had thrown an 18-year-old girl onto the street with nothing but the clothes on her back, fully expecting her to break. Instead, the streets of Wall Street forged me into a weapon. I did not mourn the loss of my family, because they ceased being my family the day they abandoned me. They were merely a hostile corporate entity that had unlawfully withheld my assets, and I had just executed a flawless permanent acquisition. The heavy doors of the boardroom clicked open behind me. Pierce and Elias walked back into the suite. My lead attorney and my forensic analyst looked completely exhausted, but their eyes gleamed with the unmistakable thrill of absolute victory. They had just helped orchestrate the greatest corporate takedown of their careers. "The federal agents have secured the building lobby," Pierce reported, loosening his silk tie. "Richard, Diane, Felicity, and Andre are all currently in the back of federal transport vehicles heading downtown for processing. The FBI has officially seized the corporate servers based on the flash drive you provided. It is a total sweep, boss. They are not coming back from this." "Excellent work, Pierce," I said, turning away from the window to face my lieutenants. But we are not finished yet. The eradication of Richard's criminal enterprise was merely step one. Now we secure the capital. I pulled my encrypted phone from my blazer pocket and dialed my executive receptionist. Gavin answered on the first ring, his voice crisp and alert despite the brutal hour. Gavin, I instructed, my tone shifting into pure operational efficiency. I need you to contact our legal liaisons at the probate court the second the clerk's office opens this morning. Send them the official FBI arrest records for Richard and Felicity Carmichael, along with a certified copy of the corporate surrender documents. I want Judge Warren to lift the temporary injunction on my grandfather's trust before his morning coffee. Understood, Miss Carmichael, Gavin replied smoothly. Drafting the priority legal courier request now. The injunction will be shattered by 9 o'clock. Once the freeze is lifted, initiate an immediate full transfer of the $50 million trust into our Tier 1 secure holding accounts, I commanded. My grandfather spent his entire life building that wealth, and my father nearly burned it to the ground to save his own pathetic ego. The capital is finally coming home. We are going to manage it properly, insulate it from the shadow debt, and ensure no one ever touches it again. I will have the routing numbers staged and ready for the transfer, boss, Elias chimed in, already tapping away on his encrypted tablet. The funds will be locked behind our firewall by noon. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The war was officially over. The $50 million legacy was secure, the $30 million toxic debt was neutralized, and the people who had tried to bury me were currently sitting in holding cells facing decades in federal prison. I walked back to the mahogany table and picked up my sleek, custom leather briefcase. I snapped the brass locks shut, the sharp metallic sound echoing with finality in the empty room. There was nothing left for me here in this monument to my father's staggering hubris. It was time to return to my own empire. I walked toward the heavy boardroom doors, Pierce and Elias falling into step behind me. We moved through the plush, silent corridors of the executive floor, bypassing the empty cubicles and the dark reception desk. The building felt completely different now. The suffocating arrogance of the Carmichael Real Estate Group had been entirely exorcised, leaving behind a massive, highly lucrative blank slate. As we reached the glass elevators that would take us down to the street level, I paused. I looked back at the sprawling reception area. Above the polished granite desk hung a massive, gleaming silver sign bearing the name of the company my father had used to terrorize his own family. Pierce, I said, my voice cutting through the quiet morning air with absolute, undisputed authority. Yes, boss, my lead attorney asked, stopping beside the open elevator doors. I gestured toward the massive silver letters mounted on the granite wall. Take down the Carmichael Real Estate sign, I instructed, stepping into the elevator and pressing the lobby button. Put up Carmichael in black. The story of Sienna powerfully illustrates that our worth is never defined by those who fail to value us. When faced with deep betrayal, the ultimate victory isn't found in screaming matches or begging for love. Instead, true power lies in building unshakable independence and setting boundaries made of steel. Sienna didn't just survive her family's cruelty, she used her massive success to actively reclaim her dignity. We cannot always control how toxic people treat us, but we completely control how we respond. Stand firm in your truth. Please share your own survival experiences and comment down below right now.